Power rises and falls across the galaxy, but what happens when that power is measured not in armies or fleets, but in the quiet pulse of life itself? The answer is a single Sith Lord, a figure who sought to command the unseen currents of existence, where stars are born and die, and yet the Force flows on indifferent. This is the story of one mind that dared to reach into that current and refuse the final silence of death. For thousands of years, empires have burned across the galactic map, republics have crumbled under corruption and war, and the endless conflict between dark side and light side has scarred worlds beyond counting. Yet beneath all of that noise, the Force has remained constant. It binds Jedi and Sith, smugglers and senators, the smallest microorganism and the brightest supernova in a single invisible web. To most beings, that web is a mystery. To some, it is a comfort to a few. It is a challenge in Sith terms. The question is simple. If death is a rule, can it be broken? If the Force governs life, can it be rewritten? Most beings fear change and cling to fragile moments of peace. Others embrace conflict and conquest, building an empire on fear and fire. But there exists a rarer obsession, the desire not just to wield the dark side in battle, but to bend the boundary between life and death itself. What followed was a quiet search for control. More absolute than any throne, at the center of that search stands Darth Plagueis, a Muun Sith Lord, born among the cold vaults and crystalline storms of Midichlorians in public. He was Hego Damask, a financier whose influence reached deep into the intergalactic banking clan in secret. He was a master of hidden laboratories and unmarked test subjects, more scientist than warrior, more patient, schemer than raging conqueror. His lightsaber was an afterthought. His true weapon was knowledge of Midichlorians, the microscopic messengers of the Force that lived within every cell over time. Plagueis came to believe that those tiny presences could be commanded, sought to prevent death, to heal any wound, to extend his own existence, until history itself bent around his continued presence. While other Sith dreamed of open war and burning Jedi temples, he dreamed of experiments, quiet rituals, and long calculations. He reinterpreted the rule of two, not as a cycle of violent replacement, but as a controlled lineage in which master and apprentice might one day transcend mortality together. This is the story of his entire life and legacy, told slowly from obscure beginnings in Sith secrecy to a quiet murder in a luxury apartment on Coruscant. The pacing here will remain steady, measured a calm historical recounting, meant to drift through the dark as the galaxy outside sleeps. What they found there would change everything. Applies not to a single planet, but to the discoveries in his laboratories and in the heart of his chosen apprentice. To understand Darth Plagueis, this journey will move through ancient Sith history, the rise and fall of empires, the shadowed corridors of galactic politics, and the most intimate experiments with life and death. Each moment will unfold as one continuous sleep, friendly narrative, tracing how one Muun's obsession would shape the fate of the Force itself and set the stage for an apprentice named Palpatine, who waited quietly in the wings. From myths to Muun's, placing Plagueis in galactic history. Plagueis' journey did not begin in a vacuum. It emerged from a darkness that had been refining itself for thousands of years, long before a Muun banker ever whispered Sith philosophy into the ear of a young politician from Naboo. The galaxy had already been shaped and scarred by those who served the dark side. The story of Darth Plagueis is only one thread woven into an immense tapestry of conflict, ambition, and forbidden knowledge. Across galactic history, the Sith rose and fell in cycles, empires blazing into existence, and then collapsing under the weight of their own hunger, from the ancient Dark Lords of Korriban and Zeost to the wars of Exar-Kun Revan and the later hidden machinations of Darth Bane. Each age added new methods, new deceptions, new ways to pursue power. What followed was a gradual evolution from open war to quiet infiltration, from legions of warriors to pairs of masters and apprentices moving unseen in the shadows of the Republic. In popular imagination, the Sith often appear as monstrous sorcerers haunting forgotten tombs and ruined temples. Yet the story of the Sith is inseparable from the Jedi and the Republic themselves. Every major Sith resurgence has mirrored a Jedi crisis and a political fracture: the Great Hyperspace War, the New Sith Wars, the Ruusan Reformation. Each moment revealed that the Sith were not simply external invaders. They were the dark reflection of the galaxy's own fears and desires, shaped by the same institutions they sought to destroy. By the time Plagueis was born, the great Sith empires were long gone. The rule of two had been in place for the next 1,000 years, forcing the Sith to abandon open conquest and instead weaponize patient subtlety and disguise. When Plagueis stepped into history, it was roughly a few decades before the Clone Wars and the rise of the Empire, an era remembered as peaceful. Yet beneath that calm, the Senate was paralyzed by corruption. Corporations were rising to unprecedented influence, and the Jedi Order had grown confident that the Sith were extinct. Plagueis stood at a convergence point to traditions that stretched back to Ajunta Pall and Darth Bane, yet operating in a modern galaxy of banking clans, trade federations and regulatory committees. In this age, power was measured in credits as much as in lightsabers. His Muun heritage and his role within the intergalactic banking clan allowed him to move through the highest levels of finance, while his Sith identity channeled the ancient hunger of Korriban into stock markets, loan agreements, and planetary debts. Against this backdrop, the Jedi remained the quiet, counterweight guardians of the light side who believed the dark side had been contained. Their order patrolled borders, mediated disputes, and served as symbols of stability, unaware that the rule of two had matured into something far more insidious. To understand why Plagueis believed he could reshape destiny itself, it becomes necessary to look backward into the origins of the Sith, to trace how an old creed of passion and domination survived defeat, adapted to new eras, and finally found expression in a Muun scientist of the dark side whose experiments would shape the fate of the galaxy. Before Plagueis, the first shadows of the Sith, long before Darth Plagueis walked the cold vaults of Midichlorians or whispered to the Force in secret laboratories, the galaxy had already begun to argue with itself about power. The conflict that would shape his every belief did not begin with banks or senates, but with monks in simple robes sitting in quiet halls, listening to an invisible current in those distant ages. The Jedi Order was not yet an arm of the Republic. It was a wandering brotherhood of seekers, moving from world to world, guided by visions and quiet intuition. They studied the Force as a living mystery, not a weapon. They spoke of balance of the light side and the dark side as twin aspects of a single cosmic tide, and their role was to understand that tide rather than command it over time. However, something subtle changed. As the Jedi codified their teachings, they built temples, formalized training, and wrote rules to keep their students from losing themselves in passion, fear, or anger. Those rules protected many, but they also created pressure within the Order. A small number of Jedi began to feel the walls closing in. They saw the Force not only as a guide, but as a reservoir of untapped power. Around these restless figures gathered quiet discussions in meditation chambers and archives. Questions whispered more than spoken. Why should a Jedi turn away from powerful emotions if those emotions could fuel greater insight? Why refuse aggressive techniques if a single devastating strike might end a war before it began? What followed was a slow but profound divergence of philosophy. These dissidents were fascinated by the raw, unrestrained side of the Force. They experimented with channeling rage in controlled settings. They used fear as a lens to sharpen awareness. They probed wounds in the spirit rather than soothing them, believing that suffering could be transformed into strength. In their view, restraint was not wisdom, it was a chain. The Jedi Council watched this movement with growing concern, and when warnings failed, the Order confronted its own shadow. This crisis would enter galactic history as the first great schism. It was not yet an empire rising against the Republic. It was a family argument turned violent Jedi against Jedi over what the Force truly demanded. On one side stood those who believed harmony and selflessness. were the only safe paths on the other, those who insisted that passion, ambition, and even pain were necessary to unlock the Force's deepest secrets. Battles were fought not for territory, but for an idea. That idea was simple and dangerous, that true mastery required embracing the dark side. Rather than denying it, in the end the Orthodox Jedi prevailed, but the rebels were not erased. They were cast out, scattered into the depths of space, carrying with them a new creed built on hunger and will. For thousands of years, that first turning away from restraint would echo across forgotten worlds, refining itself through war cults and hidden orders, until at last it reached a Muun mathematician of the dark, whose careful experiments would push that ancient heresy to its ultimate extreme, the 100-year darkness. When ideas became war cast out into the void, those first heretics left behind more than wounded pride. They left behind a question: if the Force granted power, why should that power be bound in chains of restraint? The story of the 100-year darkness began as an attempt to answer that question with doctrine, but what followed was an answer written in blood and fire around 7,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. The Jedi schism hardened into open camps. On one side stood the Orthodox Jedi, still devoted to harmony, balance, and service. They meditated on the light side, speaking of serenity and selflessness. On the other stood the so-called Dark Jedi, who had embraced anger, ambition, and the raw hunger for control. To them, passion was not a danger, but a weapon. The Force was not a current to drift upon, but a storm to seize over time. This ideological fracture could no longer be contained in council chambers. Disputes over acceptable techniques became accusations of treason. Experiments with forbidden Force powers were denounced, then defended, then hidden in secret strongholds. When Dark Jedi began twisting the Force to rip knowledge from minds and shatter bodies, at a distance the Order responded with censure. Exile. That censure was answered with rebellion. The conflict that followed would shape galactic history. It became known as the 100-Year Darkness, a prolonged, brutal war in which the Dark Jedi abandoned every restraint. They turned to alchemy and sorcery, not as curiosities, but as instruments of mass murder on shattered worlds. Their laboratories birthed monstrous war beasts, hulking creatures fused from multiple species, their flesh bound together by the dark side, and driven forward by implanted pain. Battlefields across the frontier became nightmares. Entire valleys churned with abominations that shrugged off blaster fire and tore through Jedi lines. In close combat, rivers ran black with corrupted ichor, where alchemical plagues had been tested on civilian populations. Cities fell not only to fleets and armies, but to experiments in terror. The Dark Jedi weaponized fear itself, using the Force to amplify panic until crowds trampled one another in blind flight. The scale of the war broke any illusion of the Jedi as distant, serene guardians. They were forced into a grim, grinding campaign system. By system, they fought not only enemy warriors, but the aftermath of twisted research worlds where the population had been enslaved for rituals or sacrifice to feed vast constructs of dark energy. Entire sectors destabilized as trade collapsed and local governments bowed to whoever could promise protection. From the next horror on remote moons, the Dark Jedi carved living prisoners into components for their experiments, testing how far life could be pushed before the Force abandoned it. This cold willingness to treat sentient beings as raw material became a defining mark of what would one day be called Sith tradition. For thousands of years, that legacy of weaponized suffering would echo whenever a Dark Lord sought new paths to power in ages to come. The grotesque beasts and open rituals of the 100-Year Darkness would fade into legend, but the mindset behind them endured. Eventually, it would reappear in a quieter form in laboratories rather than war camps, in surgical theaters rather than open battlefields. When a Muun mathematician of the dark turned his attention to the smallest building blocks of life, the old question of how far the Force could be bent would return with clinical precision, defeat and mercy. The exile that created the Sith. In the end, the pursuit of forbidden knowledge always returns to its source power. Challenged power, broken power, forced to reckon with the cost of its own ambition. The 100-Year Darkness was no exception. Its final reckoning came not in a laboratory, but on a battlefield around 6,900 years before the Battle of Yavin. The Dark Jedi Rebellion reached its last stand on a desolate world called Korbos. There, the combined might of the Jedi Order and the Republic military converged on the renegades. The story of the battle was brutal, and brief artillery rained down on fortified positions. Starfighters screamed over toxic canyons, and ranks of Republic soldiers advanced behind Jedi Guardians, whose blades cut through the smoke and ash on the ground. The Dark Jedi fought with a desperate, unfocused fury. They hurled boulders with the Force unleashed storms of lightning and twisted the minds of enemy commanders, but they were outnumbered and exhausted. Their monstrous war beasts fell under coordinated bombardment. Their alchemical abominations burned in fields of fire. One by one, their strongholds collapsed. What followed was a systematic dismantling of their rebellion. By the battle's end, the outcome was clear. The Dark Jedi were defeated. Their armies shattered, their war machines reduced to wreckage. Their leaders dragged from bunkers and ritual chambers in binders of light-dampening metal. The Jedi stood over fallen former comrades, while Republic officers waited for a verdict. Execution would have been simple, clean, permanent. Instead, the Republic chose something that felt more civilized in the months that followed Korbos. The response unfolded not as a spectacle of vengeance, but as an administrative process. The captured Dark Jedi were catalogued and processed, their armor removed piece by piece, ceremonial masks, alchemical talismans, and personal holocrons taken and sealed away. Their weapons were stripped. First, lightsabers, dismantled power cells, drained crystals archived for study. Then even mundane blades and tools were confiscated until the prisoners stood in plain, utilitarian garments, anonymous, in long lines. Transport ships were chosen with similar restraint. Not gleaming cruisers of the front lines, but outdated vessels pulled from reserve fleets, their hulls scarred from earlier conflicts, their hyperdrives functional yet imprecise. Each transport was assigned a minimal escort and a set of coordinates beyond the mapped hyperlanes, beyond known space. The orders were simple: deliver the exiles to the edge of the galactic frontier and release them. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history. The Republic believed it was sparing lives and avoiding the moral stain of mass execution. The Jedi hoped that distance from the core and from the light side would blunt the rage of their fallen brethren. Instead, they cast highly trained Force sensitives into the dark with nothing left but their bitterness, their knowledge, and their will to survive. What they found there would change everything over time. Those exiles would encounter the Sith species on Korriban and build an empire in their own image. For thousands of years, their descendants would haunt galactic history, and for the next 1,000 years after that, the Sith would continue to underestimate the consequences of their own cleverness. Just as the Republic had on Korbos one day, a Muun named Darth Plagueis would make the same mistake with his apprentice, continuing a pattern that began with a single, merciful choice: Korriban's red skies. Meeting the native Sith cast into the depths of the unknown regions, the defeated Dark Jedi drifted in crippled vessels, their hyperdrives scarred by desperate jumps and half-mad calculations. The war was over, but the story of their order was not yet finished. Their exile became a slow unraveling of hope as provisions ran low and tempers flared in the silence between stars. They searched for any habitable world, any chance to rebuild their power. After weeks of wandering through uncharted space, their sensors finally caught a signal. A barren yet breathable world orbiting a dim sun when their ships descended through turbulent clouds. What they found there would change everything. The sky burned a constant rust-red horizon to horizon storms dragged curtains of dust across jagged mountain ranges, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with a low oppressive tension. This was Korriban, a harsh graveyard world steeped in an ancient unseen presence in the Force on the surface. The exiles discovered they were not alone. Korriban was home to the native Sith species, tall, red-skinned humanoids with heavy brow ridges and bone spurs jutting from their cheeks and jaws. Their eyes burned amber and yellow, attuned instinctively to the dark side they lived in. Clustered city-states and temple complexes ruled by warlike kings and priest castes. Their society was primitive in technology, but rich in ritual sacrifice, funerary processions and blood oaths sworn before towering stone idols. The arrival of armored starships and humming energy blades shattered the old balance of the planet. Expectation might suggest immediate open war, yet what followed was more insidious. The Dark Jedi recognized the raw dark power coiling through the Sith people, and the Sith recognized in these pale off-worlders a terrifying resemblance to their own gods. The exiles presented themselves as divine sorcerers, emissaries of death and conquest. The native Sith bowed not in ignorance but in calculated fear and ambition. Over time, a new hierarchy emerged. The Dark Jedi became lords over the Sith species, teaching them advanced applications of the Force while adopting their brutal customs. They blended incantations and blood rites with structured telekinesis and Force lightning. Sith kings became vassals to Dark Lords, their priests rebranded as acolytes and adepts, and in the shadow of Korriban's red sky, the first formal Sith Empire began to take shape. This fusion was not only cultural, it was biological intermarriage between the human and near-human exiles, and the red-skinned Sith produced hybrid lineages, noble houses that carried both refined training and innate affinity for the dark side. Children born from these unions were raised in fortress temples, drilled in both mystic chants and disciplined combat techniques. Passion and power were no longer private heresies against the Jedi. They became the explicit creed of an emerging order. By the time Ajunta Pal and his peers formalized their rule, a subtle but crucial shift had occurred. The word Sith no longer referred only to the native species. It became the name of an order, a tradition of dark side practitioners bound by blood doctrine and ambition for thousands of years. That single linguistic change would shape galactic history, echoing forward through empires and betrayals until it reached a Muun named Darth Plagueis, who inherited the same hunger born under Korriban's red skies. From Dark Jedi to Dark Lords, the birth of the Sith Order. Power defines identity, but what happens when an exiled handful of dark mystics reshape an entire civilization around their will? The answer is the birth of the Sith Order in the generations after their arrival on Korriban. The fallen Jedi did not simply rule through fear. They reorganized an entire culture. What followed was a slow consolidation of power. The native Sith species, with their warrior priests and blood-soaked rituals, were bound to the discipline of former Jedi training. The exiles took the chaotic rites of the red-skinned Sith and fused them with structured tutelage in the Force, creating academies, temples, and tomb complexes that doubled as training grounds and instruments of terror. Around this time, a new hierarchy emerged. The exiles and their descendants placed themselves above the native population as a ruling caste of Force users. They alone interpreted the will of the dark side. They alone commanded the armies of slaves and soldiers by combining arcane Sith magic with refined lightsaber forms. They forged an elite class whose authority was both spiritual and brutally practical. Their power was not questioned, it was worshipped. From this crucible came a title that would shape galactic history. The first Dark Lord of the Sith proclaimed absolute dominion over Korriban Zeost and the growing empire. Beyond this was more than a rank. It was a theological statement. The Dark Lord stood as the living nexus of the dark side head of the warrior priests, master of the academies, and unquestioned ruler of every subject world under this banner. The scattered enclaves of dark adepts became a unified order. Over time, the language itself began to bend around this new reality. The word Sith still named the original species, but it also came to describe the order of dark side adepts that ruled them in inscriptions and holocrons. The distinctions slowly blurred until the order eclipsed the people who birthed it. For thousands of years later, scholars would argue whether Sith first meant species creed or empire, while the Dark Lords cared only that it meant power. Among the earliest of these figures, Ajunta Pal stood as an archetype of what the Sith would become. Once a Jedi general, he embraced his new role as conqueror and lawgiver. His decrees on passion, strength, and domination were carved into stone and etched into holocrons. Pal taught that conflict purified the strong and that mercy was a betrayal of the dark side under his influence. The Sith codified an ideology where ambition was virtue and restraint was weakness. This is the story of an order discovering itself, and in that discovery, lay the seed of Darth Plagueis' obsession for the next 1,000 years, and beyond, every Dark Lord traced authority back to these first exiles. Even a cold Muun scientist on distant Maigito would revere their lineage and their titles, seeing his own experiments as the latest verse in an ancient litany. Yet in the shadows of that proud tradition, another, more secret creed was already forming one that would one day demand Plagueis' life. An empire of stone and fear. Early Sith power. That secret creed did not emerge in a vacuum. It grew from an empire already built on fearstone and blood for thousands of years before Plagueis, the Sith, had refined a civilization whose very architecture advertised its theology on the desert world of Korriban and the frozen sphere of Ziost. The first true capital worlds of the Sith Empire rose from the dust and ice, towering citadels of dark stone stabbed at the sky, while beneath them ran deep tombs and cavernous halls. Carved for the honored dead and the eternally enslaved around these fortresses, sprawled slave cities that clung to the bases of cliffs and temple plateaus, their streets choked with laborers, soldiers, and administrators, all existing to feed the power of a narrow Sith elite. The story of these worlds was simple and brutal. Everything in sight existed to remind the living of their place in the hierarchy. Even the dead were pressed into service, their sarcophagi arranged in endless ranks to channel the dark side through runes, statues, and buried holocrons. At the core of this empire stood a belief that would shape every generation of Sith. Conflict was not a failure of politics or morality. Conflict was the point where the Jedi sought balance between dark side and light side. The Sith taught that struggle was the only honest expression of the Force to them. Peace produced weakness, war, refined strength in their academies. On Korriban, instructors hurled acolytes against one another in duels and trials, not to maintain order, but to see who survived above those training pits. The hierarchy was brutally clear. At the apex stood the Dark Lord of the Sith, the supreme master of doctrine and destiny. Beneath the Dark Lord ruled powerful Sith Lords, each governing a sector or a world from palaces on Ziost, Droman Khas, or lesser strongholds. They commanded fleets, armies, and courts of schemers. Below them clustered lesser lords, overseers, alchemists, and inquisitors. Then came the acolytes and warriors, and beneath all of them, the vast mass of enslaved or subjugated populations who mined, built, and died to sustain the empire. Within this structure, betrayal was not an aberration, it was policy. The rules of internal competition were stark challenge. The master, if strong enough, succeed, and the empire accepted the outcome fail. And the consequences were death, mutilation, or a fate entombed alive in the very catacombs that powered Sith rituals. What followed was a culture of constant, ruthless calculations. No ally was trusted completely. No rival was underestimated. Every feast could become an assassination. Every council a prelude to civil war. Despite this permanent tension, the early Sith Empire expanded steadily for the next 1,000 years, largely in isolation from the Republic. Its fleets pushed into nearby systems where primitive or fractured civilizations offered little resistance. Worlds were conquered, stripped, and remade in the image of Korriban and Ziost. Colossal statues lined new plazas. Academies drilled fresh generations in the dark side, and holocrons preserved doctrine over time. This created an empire that seemed unassailable from within, and invisible from without. That apparent distance from the wider galactic order would not last, and in later ages, a Muun named Hego Damask would study these ancient empires and reach a chilling conclusion: why rule from distant tomb worlds when the Republic itself could become the throne? Faces in the tombs, legendary Sith. Before Plagueis to understand why Hego Damask looked at the Republic and saw a future throne, it is necessary to look backward into the tombs he studied among the dust of Korriban and the silent vaults of long-fallen empires. The story of the Sith is written in stone masks and cursed metal. Each face in those catacombs carried lessons that would shape his quiet approach to power. Millennia before his birth, a Junta Pol stood as the first and most haunting of those faces, a dark Jedi exile cast out after the 100-year darkness. He was not merely a warrior, but a warrior philosopher. He forged blades steeped in the dark side weapons that whispered to their wielders and refused to be forgotten. His tomb on Korriban held treasures, relics, and inscriptions that were more warning than boast. Ajunta Pal showed that Sith power could endure even when flesh failed, that a single will could echo for thousands of years through artifacts and legend. Over time, other names were carved into that same red. Stone among them, Ludo Kresh and Naga Sado, embodiments of ambition turned inward until it devoured its own empire. When Marka Ragnos died, the fragile balance of the Sith shattered. Kresh clung to tradition and caution. Sado reached for conquest and the wider galactic stage. What followed was a civil struggle masquerading as a golden opportunity. A lost Republic ship stumbled into Sith space, and what they found there would change everything. Sado seized the chance, unleashed illusions, battle meditation, and invading fleets, while Kresh tried to stop him. The result was spectacular war, followed by catastrophic collapse. This was the pattern interrupt in Sith history, the moment that revealed how easily internal conflict could destroy even the mightiest domain. Sado fled to Yavin 4, entombing himself beneath titanic pyramids. Kresh died in the chaos. Their rivalry became a cautionary tale etched into every later holocron ambition. Without discipline meant extinction. Then there was Tulak Horde, different kind of warning, remembered as one of the greatest duelists the Sith ever produced. He combined unmatched lightsaber skill with terrifying dark side techniques. He carved a trail of conquered worlds across the Outer Rim, building fortresses and monuments that were weapons in their own right. His legacy proved that the Sith tradition was not only mystical, but brutally physical, the Force expressed through both ritual and blade. Each of these figures extended Sith influence to specific worlds. Korriban Ziost, Yavin 4, Droman Kars. They raised temples, carved statues, buried sarcophagi, and sealed away holocrons for the next 1,000 years. Their artifacts waited in the dark, inviting later generations to study, reinterpret, and twist their meaning. When Hego Damask and others of his era sifted through these remnants, they found recurring traits: ambition, obsession, and a cold willingness to sacrifice entire populations for a single experiment. Plagueis absorbed these lessons but redirected them. Instead of open war, he envisioned financial strangulation, political puppetry, and experiments conducted in laboratories rather than on battlefields. The same darkness moved more quietly, the same hunger for control, simply traded roaring conquests for patient manipulation, setting the stage for a different kind of Sith dominion. And in those tombs, another question lingered: if ancient lords could bend empires, what might happen if one learned to bend life and death themselves? Life under the red sun. Everyday Sith civilization. Under that question, the answer was not just a single Sith Lord. It was an entire civilization built to make that question feel inevitable. The ancient Sith Empire turned its worlds into monuments to dominance every horizon, framed by stone and metal that reminded the weak of their place across Korriban Ziost, and later Droman Kars. The skyline was carved into jagged silhouettes, colossal pyramids, and knife-edged spires thrust upward from red deserts and black forests. Their proportions were deliberate doors, oversized corridors, cavernous halls, all calculated so that any individual standing within them felt small, powerless. And watch the architecture itself was a constant lesson in who held power. These were not cities of gentle curves and open plazas. They were grids of causeways leading towards central temples, flanked by statues of robed lords and horned warriors, each figure frozen mid-triumph over a broken enemy. Even residential blocks echoed. That severity, narrow windows, thick walls, and recessed entrances created shadows everywhere, a physical reflection of the dark side, saturating Sith life within those vast temples. The training infrastructure of the Empire took shape from the moment Sith-born children could walk. They were led through echoing corridors into academies where instructors spoke of the Force in terms of weapon and leverage. Not harmony, what followed was a lifetime of conditioning cruelty, presented as strength, hesitation treated as treason, sparring rings stained by generations of failure in these halls. Failure was never abstract. An acolyte who faltered in a duel felt bone break under a master's telekinetic grip. One who showed mercy watched a rival executed as an example. Over time, the rule of the strong hardened into instinct, the idea that compassion was weakness and that the only safety lay in becoming more dangerous than anyone nearby. Beyond the temple walls, everyday order mirrored those lessons. Mines and fields stretched out beneath the red sun, worked by slaves taken in war or bred in bondage. They chipped at obsidian cliffs and harvested twisted crops, while overseers watched from raised platforms, whips in one hand and the force in the other. A thought could become a chokehold. A gesture could send a worker crashing into the dust. In such a society, the awareness was constant at any moment. A Sith might decide a life had lost its usefulness. There were no courts to appeal to, no neutral authorities, only the shifting moods of those who commanded the dark side and the technology that amplified it. Shock collars paired with force lightning interrogation chambers where machines and sorcery worked in tandem politically. This culture did not reward open civil war for long. The Empire learned that endless battlefield conflict drained resources and invited Jedi intervention, so its ruling class refined subtler methods. Assassination became an accepted instrument of promotion, a poisoned cup or sabotage shutter, a quiet coup masked as an accident. The story of succession among Dark Lords was written in unexplained disappearances and sudden opportunities, in council chambers. Veiled threats carried more weight than shouted defiance. A glance between rivals might promise a future betrayal. Alliances were temporary scaffolds built only to be kicked away, once they had served their purpose for thousands of years. This atmosphere would shape Sith expectations of leadership. No throne was ever truly secure. No master ever entirely trusted an apprentice within this framework. Dark side sorcery was not fringe heresy, but daily craft. Alchemists in underground laboratories twisted beasts into war forms. Healers reversed injuries only to inflict them again in the next experiment. And chanting circles drew sigils across stone floors in blood and luminous dust. The boundary between science and ritual blurred. Dissected bodies lay beside holocrons, humming with forbidden formulae. To the Sith, these acts were routine maintenance of power, not atrocities. A lord commissioning a ritual to bind a spirit to a weapon was performing administrative work, ensuring that assets remained useful. A magister draining prisoners to fuel a storm saw only energy transfer. This normalization of cruelty would shape later generations. When a Muun banker on Megiddo approached the Force as a ledger to be balanced, his experiments on life and death were merely an echo of practices that had stood under the red sun for the next 1,000 years. And in that long shadow, another question quietly formed. If an empire could accept such horrors as ordinary, what might happen when one of its heirs gained the patience to hide those horrors behind contracts, Senate votes, and medical charts? Rise, fall, repeat, the long rhythm of Sith history. That question did not appear from nowhere. It rose from a pattern written in blood and ash across galactic history. Power corrupts, but what happens when that power is guided by the dark side and measured not in years or decades, but in ages? The answer is the Sith, learning from their own disasters for thousands of years. After those first empires under the Red Sun, the Sith repeated the same rhythm, expansion, confrontation, collapse around 5,000 years before Yavin the Great Hyperspace War erupted, when the hidden Sith Empire finally crashed into the Republic. What followed was a brutal clash of fleets and Force users. Naga Sado hurled illusions and solar flares at his enemies, yet even in victory, he was undermined by rival Sith Lords. The Empire fractured, and the Republic struck back hard. Korriban and Zeos burned, and the Sith seemed finished. But the story of the Sith never ended so cleanly. In the shadows, a survivor named Vitiate performed a vast dark ritual, consuming an entire world to fuel his own immortality. With a chosen remnant, he fled to Dromund Kaas. There, he forged a secret empire that would brood in the dark for the next 1,000 years. While the Republic believed the threat was gone, the Sith were only changing shape over time. Echoes of that hidden power stirred elsewhere. Artifacts and spirits awoke fallen Jedi and ambitious warlords. Freedom, Nadon Onderon, Exar Kun on Yavin 4. Each era produced new Dark Lords, new wars, new atrocities, the Great Sith War, the Mandalorian conflicts, and the Jedi Civil War. Under Darth Revan and Darth Malak, shattered planets and orders alike. Each conflict ended the same way. The Sith overreached the Jedi, and the Republic rallied, and the would-be conquerors were betrayed from within or crushed from without. Several turning points carved this lesson into Sith memory at Ruusan, 1,000 years before Yavin, the Brotherhood of Darkness, waged open war with the Jedi across the galaxy, believing sheer numbers and raw aggression would finally break the light side. Instead, their own General Khan allowed desperation to drive him into a superweapon of the dark side. The thought bomb annihilated Jedi and Sith together in a single blinding instant. The Republic survived, the Sith did not, or so the victors believed. From this devastation, a quieter realization emerged. Brute empires invited annihilation, open banners and massed armies only drew the full attention of the Jedi Council and the Senate. The survivors who watched these cycles understood that the dark side could not win through spectacle alone. Subtlety, patience, and infiltration offered another path. In the ruins of those failed crusades, a new doctrine would take shape, a radical answer to centuries of self-destruction. It was called the Rule of Two, and in time, it would define the world into which Darth Plagueis was born. Bane's solution, the Rule of Two, and a new kind of Sith power, destroys itself. But what happens when destruction becomes a tradition, passed down through generations? The answer is the Sith. At the end of one of their greatest collapses, when empires of the dark side had risen and fallen in fire, a single survivor stepped out of the ashes. His name was Darth Bane. Around 1,000 years before the films, the Sith had once again torn themselves apart in open war against the Jedi and against each other. Countless lords, warlords, and pretenders grasped for power. Entire fleets clashed across the galactic core. Their final effort ended in catastrophe on Ruusan, where the last great Sith army was annihilated. Bane watched this from within and reached a brutal conclusion. The problem was not only the Jedi, the problem was the Sith themselves. Bane studied Sith history for thousands of years of conflict, betrayal, and civil war. He saw a pattern. Every time the dark side gathered in great numbers, it devoured its own masters. Apprentices and rivals cut each other down in endless cycles of revenge. Any empire they built crumbled under the weight of their infighting. The story of the Sith was not just opposition to the light side, it was self-sabotage. His answer was terrifying in its simplicity. There would be only two Sith, at any time a master to embody power and an apprentice to crave it. This was the Rule of Two. Under this doctrine, the master would hold the accumulated knowledge of the dark side, while the apprentice would be driven by hunger to surpass and eventually destroy the master. In doing so, the apprentice would prove worthy to carry the line forward, and what followed was a far colder, more focused vision of Sith ambition. Bane dismantled what remained of the old Sith structures, rather than rebuild grand temples and announce a new empire. He chose to disappear. The Sith would no longer march openly against the Republic. Instead, they would hide in the shadows, infiltrating the Senate, the courts, and even the Jedi Order through deception, influence, and corruption. The age of Sith legions was over, replaced by a single hidden thread winding through galactic history. Over time, this created a secret lineage, knowledge passed carefully from master to apprentice, each generation adding new techniques, forbidden law, and ruthless refinements. The dark side would be distilled, not spread thin. The Rule of Two would shape assassins, strategists, and philosophers rather than warlords. For the next 1,000 years, the Jedi believed the Sith extinct, while in truth, the line continued unbroken. It is into this invisible tradition that Darth Plagueis would be born. He would inherit not an empire, but a doctrine of patient secrecy and long-term planning. Yet Plagueis would also question the Rule of Two, testing its limits, bending its purpose. And in that, a quiet defiance. The seeds of his greatest discovery and his final mistake would be planted. From Bane to Tenebrous, a hidden line of darkness. Yet that defiance did not appear from nowhere. It was the latest variation in a hidden pattern that stretched back to Darth Bane himself. For the next 1,000 years, the Sith existed not as armies or empires, but as a single line of masters and apprentices, a thin, dark thread woven through galactic history after Bane's early experiments and the bloody failures of his first students. What followed was a long age of deliberate smallness. Each generation learned from the last that open conflict meant extinction, and that survival demanded masks. Some Sith posed as minor nobles in decaying Outer Rim dynasties. Others became scholars in obscure force cults or administrators in trade guilds. They built front organizations, shipping combines, archaeological institutes, even religious charities, all designed to move resources and information without ever revealing a red blade. Over time, these hidden lords refined the art of vanishing in plain sight. One master specialized in erasing records from Republic archives. Another turned the banking codes of the core worlds into weapons. A third orchestrated a sector-wide war purely to test how far the Senate could be pushed before the Jedi intervened. Names faded, but the pattern remained. Each apprentice learned that true power was patience, that the rule of two was not only about scarcity, but about focus. Two minds sharpening a single design aimed at a distant moment of revenge. By the final centuries, before the Clone Wars, the Sith had shifted from warriors and conquerors to something closer to shadowy strategists. Their battlefield was no longer only the Force or the lightsaber. It was economics, technology, and politics. They studied trade routes as carefully as ancient holocrons. They treated corporate charters and senatorial procedure as weapons in the same way their predecessors had treated warships and superweapons. The story of the Sith became a story of boardrooms, back channels, and quiet assassinations staged to look like accidents. Into this tradition stepped a Bith named Rugus known in the shadows as Darth Tenebrous. Bith were famed for their mathematical precision, and Tenebrous embodied that reputation. His mind approached the dark side as an engineer approached a reactor. He calculated probabilities of futures, ran simulations of galactic conflict in his head, and designed long-term schemes that would shape entire sectors. Without a single public battle, he commissioned experimental starship drives, manipulated construction guilds, and seeded technologies that could later be turned toward a reborn Sith empire. Then came a choice that would change everything. Tenebrous selected as his apprentice a Muun financier from the icy world of Megiddo, a being steeped in the language of interest rates, collateral, and debt. This Muun would take the name Darth Plagueis, and his obsession would not be fleets or fortresses, but the boundary between life and death. By merging Sith tradition with high finance and biological experimentation, Tenebrous and Plagueis pushed the line of Bane into an even stranger territory, where the dark side touched both galactic markets and the very cells of living beings. And in that convergence, the Force itself began to tremble. What new imbalance would emerge from a Sith Lord who viewed existence as something to be engineered rather than endured? A child of Megiddo, the early life of Hego Damask in the cold calculus of the Sith. There are places where entire worlds become laboratories for power. Megiddo was one of them, a frigid crystalline sphere where wealth and war were carved from the same ice. On the surface of Megiddo storms of frozen shards scoured the plains, glittering in constant twilight. Enormous crystal spires rose from the bedrock, pierced by durasteel and transparasteel, until they became towering financial citadels. There, merchant princes and corporate warlords plotted in quiet conference rooms while battles raged far below. The Muun had turned this hostile world into a fortress of credits and contracts, a place where the galactic economy and the machinery of conflict intertwined. The Moons themselves reflected their environment, tall, gaunt, and almost skeletal. They moved with a deliberate grace, their elongated faces expressionless, their voices calm, even in crisis. To many across the Republic, they seemed distant and cold, but that distance concealed a precise and calculating intelligence. For thousands of years, Moons had been renowned as bankers and financiers, the invisible scaffolding behind Republic fleets. Jedi campaigns and corporate empires in Moon culture profit was not a sudden windfall. It was a trajectory extended across generations. Decisions were weighed in decades and centuries rather than days or months. What followed was a civilization that prized stability over spectacle, influence over overt domination, and contracts over open war to outsiders. This restraint could appear almost peaceful, yet beneath it lay a relentless pursuit of advantage, an unblinking willingness to foreclose on worlds and governments when numbers demanded it within this chilled and ordered society. The story of Hego Damask began born into one of Megiddo's most powerful banking dynasties. He entered a world where balance sheets mattered more than battlefields, and where a signature could topple a government more efficiently than any fleet from his earliest years. He was surrounded by the symbols of quiet power: intergalactic banking, clan seals etched into crystalline walls, data streams of interest rates and collateral flowing past his young eyes. The banking clan did not simply hold wealth. It decided who would receive loans for starship production, who would fund planetary defenses, and which struggling systems would be left to fail over time. Hego watched entire sectors rise or crumble because of choices made. In silent boardrooms, this was his first education in the force of economics, an invisible field that bound worlds together, and yet could be bent by those who understood its currents in that environment. Patience was rewarded. A Muun learned to wait through market cycles and political upheavals, knowing that panic was merely another variable to exploit. Discretion was essential. Public outbursts could destabilize investments, so even anger became something to be amortized, measured and redirected across years. These traits would shape Hego's inner life, long before any dark side mentor spoke the word Sith. As he matured, he began to view beings the way his tutors viewed ledgers. Sentient lives became entries in vast equations, assets to be cultivated, liabilities to be trimmed, variables that could be shifted to alter outcomes. A senator's debt level, a governor's gambling habit, a Jedi temple's reliance on Republic funding, all were numbers that could be rearranged if one was patient. Enough in time, this financial abstraction fused with a deeper curiosity. If credits could move fleets and starve rebellions, what might a similar precision achieve when applied to flesh and spirit, to the very particles through which the Force communicated with living beings? The answer would not come yet, but the question lodged in Hego Damask's mind and refused to leave on frozen Megiddo. A child of ledgers, and Ice learned to see existence as a balance sheet, and in the quiet halls of the banking clan, the future, Darth Plagueis, began to imagine what it would mean to audit life and death themselves. Chosen by a Bith, Plagueis meets Darth Tenebrous. Power often hides behind respectability, but what happens when that power is the dark side itself wearing the mask of a banker? The answer is the story of Hego Damask and the Bith, who would name him Darth Plagueis. By the time Damask reached maturity within the intergalactic banking clan, his reputation was already taking shape. He was a Muun, whose decisions were cold, precise, and untroubled by sentiment. Entire corporate sectors rose or fell on his recommendations, and when worlds defaulted on their debts, his response was not anger, but quiet recalculation. This emotional distance caught the attention of a mind far older and far more dangerous, a Bith architect of the dark side, known in secret as Darth Tenebrous. Tenebrous moved through the galactic economy behind layers of aliases, engineering construction contracts, and starship designs for clients who never knew whose hand guided their fortunes. Over time, he studied the ledgers of the banking clan as carefully as any holocron, and in those ledgers, he found a pattern. Damask consistently chose outcomes that maximized control rather than simple profit. It was the thinking of a Sith, without the name Tenebrous, decided this Muun was worth more than observation. The first contact did not come in a temple or on a battlefield, but in a private negotiation suite above a frozen world. Tenebrous appeared as a refined Bith investor seeking partnership in Damask holdings. Their conversation began with trade routes and interest rates, then drifted toward more abstract questions. What was the purpose of power? What value did life hold when weighed against stability? Damask's answers were clinical. He spoke of populations as variables, of governments as assets and liabilities. This was the test Tenebrous required. What followed was a series of carefully staged crises, a minor banking scandal here, a sabotage shipment there. Tenebrous watched as Damask chose to silence witnesses rather than risk exposure. He noted the Muun's curiosity when subtle suggestions seemed to bend outcomes. Damask sensed something beyond politics at work, an unseen current in the Force. and instead of recoiling, he leaned toward it, asking for more. Only then did Tenebrous reveal the Sith, not with grand declaration but with a simple offer knowledge in exchange for absolute loyalty in secluded retreats on Midichlorians and remote laboratories hidden in corporate facilities. The Bith began to instruct his new apprentice. Damask learned to quiet his presence in the Force, to appear to Jedi as nothing more than a distant void. He practiced concealing his true nature behind the persona of a respectable financier, while Tenebrous introduced advanced Sith techniques and long-term strategic thinking grounded in economic leverage. Their relationship remained invisible. No red blades ignited in public. No Sith symbols adorned their holdings to the galactic community. They were merely a Bith designer and a Muun banker collaborating on infrastructure projects. In truth, they were mapping how to strangle entire sectors through debt and dependency. For the next 1,000 years, in their vision, war would be won, not only with fleets, but with interest rates from the beginning. Plagueis' Sith life was inseparable from economics and politics. His path differed from the martial Dark Lords who had led armies against the Jedi for thousands of years. He would seek power in balance sheets and bloodstreams, in markets and midichlorians, and as Tenebrous hinted at a deeper experiment, one that would shape the very flow of the Force itself. The apprentice listened, not yet understanding that the next lesson would cross the boundary between life and death. Learning to break the rules. Tenebrous's teachings. Power is often imagined as a blade in the hand or an army on the march. But what happens when that power hides in bylaws, balance sheets, and laboratory notes? The answer is the Sith, as reshaped by Darth Tenebrous and his chosen heir on Midichlorians in the quiet vaults where Muun financiers whispered about interest rates. Tenebrous spoke instead about the rule of two. For thousands of years, Sith masters had treated it as sacred. One master, one apprentice bound in secrecy and inevitable betrayal. Tenebrous framed it differently. He called it a design constraint, a useful fiction to limit Jedi attention and manage risk. It was not a commandment, it was a tool, and tools could be bent without breaking. What followed was a series of thought experiments more than traditional lessons. Tenebrous asked his apprentice how many servants could exist just outside the rule of two. How many proxies and agents could carry Sith well into the galactic economy without ever touching a lightsaber? The story of their partnership became a study in ambiguity. Plagueis would obey the letter of the rule while stretching its spirit across Star System's boardrooms and research labs over time. Tenebrous drilled a different discipline into his apprentice, probabilistic thinking. Instead of prophecies, there were models. Instead of visions, there were simulations. The galaxy was not a stage for duels. It was a complex system that could be nudged toward predetermined outcomes. He spoke of trade routes as arteries of the galactic body of banking regulations, as pressure points of the Force itself. A single interest rate adjustment on Midichlorians could trigger unrest on Naboo. A delayed shipment through a war zone could topple a ministry on Coruscant to make that real. They built fronts. Hego Damask, the respectable investor, appeared, while Darth Plagueis watched from behind the masked corporate shells inside the intergalactic banking clan became extensions of Sith. Intent loans were offered, then called in at pivotal moments. Governments were steered into debt until their policies bent toward hidden masters. Contracts became chains. Defaults became leverage in Tenebrous's teaching. A credit agreement could end a career as surely as a blade through the heart. Then came the laboratories. The pattern seemed clear. Sith had long pursued destructive power. Tenebrous demanded curiosity. Instead, he urged Plagueis to probe the Force in healing, in subtle manipulation, in the very scaffolding of life itself. What they found there would change everything in tissue cultures and controlled infections. Plagueis learned to sense the faint chorus of Midichlorians. He learned that by shifting that chorus, he could strengthen or silence the connection between being and Force. This was the pattern. Interrupt in Sith history, a line of Dark Lords obsessed with empires, and war had produced a scientist. Tenebrous encouraged it. He hinted that true victory over the Jedi would not come from another grand army, but from mastering the invisible symphony within every cell. For the next 1,000 years, he claimed the Order could rule if it learned to command that song. Plagueis listened, and a single forbidden idea took root. If midichlorians could be guided, could death itself be dismissed as a statistical error waiting to be corrected? In that question lay his destiny and the quiet doom of the master who had planted it. The moment of inheritance. Plagueis kills. His master, Plagueis, carried that question with him into every calculation until one day it stopped being theory and became opportunity. The moment came, not with fanfare or dramatic confrontation, but with a mining contract on an ice-shrouded world in the Mid-Rim, arranged through Hego Damask and the intergalactic banking clan on paper. It was a survey of volatile cortosis veins. In reality, it was an engineered crucible designed to place Darth Tenebrous in mortal danger, far from witnesses around that time. Tenebrous had grown fascinated with stress testing his own predictive powers. He believed his mathematical models of the Force could anticipate any threat. Plagueis encouraged this confidence, guiding his master toward personally overseeing the inspection of a cavern system riddled with unstable gas pockets, seismic faults, and overworked drilling droids. What followed was an elegant trap that never needed to be sprung, only allowed to complete its natural course, deep beneath the surface, as tremors rippled through the ice. The Muun apprentice subtly tampered with safety. Overrides droids continued cutting where they should have shut down. Tenebrous sensed the disturbance in the Force, but interpreted it as a remote anomaly, not an immediate peril. The ceiling fractured, the ground convulsed, and a cascade of stone and machinery collapsed around them. In that instant, Plagueis made his choice. He did nothing. There was no shouted challenge, no clash of blades, only the quiet betrayal of withheld aid while his master was crushed and suffocated beneath tons of debris. Plagueis watched through drifting dust, his presence in the Force carefully masked. He could have hurled aside the rubble. He could have shared his own breath through the dark side. Instead, he observed the variables of Tenebrous's death unfold with clinical precision. This was not rage. It was succession executed as a controlled experiment in cause and effect. Internally, Plagueis experienced no moral crisis. The Jedi spoke of the light side and compassion, but for him, the Force was a field of probabilities to be shaped. Tenebrous had trained him to think in these terms and now became the final, a data point in a long equation. As the Bith's life flickered, Plagueis reached out not to comfort, but to probe legends, suggest he attempted to seize his master's dying essence, to trap consciousness within failing flesh, and bend midichlorians to arrest the final shutdown of organs. The attempt failed or succeeded only partially, depending on the account. Some whisper that a fragment of Tenebrous clung to awareness for years, a disembodied intellect raging against the apprentice who had turned him into a test subject. Whatever the truth, this early brush with the boundary between life and death would shape Plagueis's growing obsession with immortality. When the cavern finally fell silent, Hego Damask emerged alone. Darth Plagueis, the newly anointed Dark Lord of the Sith, inherited not only Tenebrous's hidden networks and financial power, but centuries of secret Sith lore and a private war against the Jedi. Over time, he would push beyond his master's vision, seeking not merely to survive, but to rewrite the rules of the galactic order itself. And in the shadows, his thoughts were already turning toward the kind of apprentice who could help him reshape destiny. Hego Damask, respectable monster. Banking as a Sith weapon. Power can be measured in armies and fleets, but what happens when that power flows through interest rates and quiet signatures on credit agreements? The answer is Hego Damask, the public mask of Darth Plagueis, and the instrument through which a Sith Lord turned banking into a weapon. In the decades after Tenebrous's death, the Muun from Mygeeto rose through the intergalactic banking clan with methodical precision under the respectable name Hego Damask. He became a senior magister of Damask Holdings, directing vast rivers of credits across the galactic economy. What followed was an invisible conquest. He did not seize worlds with star destroyers. He acquired them on paper through loans, mortgages, and reconstruction funds after natural disasters or local wars over time. Entire sectors woke each morning owing Damask and the banking clan more than they could ever repay. Planetary governments mortgaged future tax revenues, mining guilds pledged uncut ore shipments, and even regional security fleets were built on Damask-backed bonds. When a world complied with his preferred policies, its debt was quietly refinanced. Terms eased. New lines of credit opened when a government resisted. A crucial loan was called in, a refinancing was denied, or a rival faction suddenly received generous funding from a seemingly unrelated shell company. This was the story of a Sith Lord who understood that in an age of Republic law and Jedi oversight, open war would draw too much attention. Instead, currency would shape the future, where starfighter squadrons could not. By manipulating credit flows, Damask altered trade routes indirectly. A freight line that refused his influence found its insurance rates rising, its docking fees mysteriously adjusted until competitors backed by Damask. Holdings outperformed it. Local elections on mid-rim worlds turned on last-minute infusions of campaign funds or the abrupt withdrawal of payroll from opposition strongholds to Plagueis. These were not moral questions, they were variables in an experiment in galactic engineering, on Megiddo, in the silent vaults of Muun, in private retreats on worlds such as Sojourn. He watched graphs and projections, the way ancient Sith watched battle maps. Entire populations became numbers in a ledger columns to be shifted until the pattern of power suited his design. If a famine relief loan kept a world stable that was acceptable, if denying that same loan toppled a government that was acceptable as well. For thousands of years, Sith Lords had relied on fear sabers and storms of dark side energy. Plague is added compound interest and derivative instruments to the arsenal. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history in its own twisted form when he quietly forgave a strategic debt or stabilized it. Collapsing currency, he created gratitude and dependence that could be harvested later, and when he crushed a market or collapsed a treasury, the Jedi sensed only political unrest, not the cold hand of a Sith economist in the final years. Before the Clone Wars, this financial empire would find its perfect complement on a distant pastoral world called Naboo. There, Hego Damask identified a gifted politician named Palpatine, and what they found there would change everything. Damask's hidden credit networks and Palpatine's rising ambition would fuse into a single strategy against the Republic, but the full extent of that partnership and the price the galaxy would pay had only begun to reveal itself. The scientist of the Sith, Plagueis and the Midichlorians. Power sustains, corrupts, and eventually abandons all living things. Yet the Sith refused to accept that final abandonment. If the Force bound every cell, every heartbeat, could its currents be rewritten? For Darth Plagueis, the answer was not a philosophy, but an experiment. In the quiet years after Hego Damask and Palpatine first aligned their ambitions on Naboo, another project unfolded, far from senates and elections. While Damask manipulated credit flows and trade routes, Darth Plagueis turned inward, to the smallest scales of existence. The story of his life's work was not a tale of armies and fleets, but of microscopic life forms that no naked eye could see, yet that would shape the fate of the galactic saga. In the doctrine of both Jedi and Sith, Midichlorians were known, if rarely discussed. These were symbiotic organisms dwelling within the cells of all living beings, tiny intermediaries that allowed consciousness to hear and respond to the Force. A higher concentration meant a stronger connection, greater sensitivity, and the potential for extraordinary power. To most Jedi, this was a mystery to be respected. To Plagueis, it was a mechanism to be mastered. His reasoning was chilling in its simplicity. If midichlorians mediated the will of the Force, then altering them might alter that will. If their activity could be heightened, suppressed, or redirected, perhaps life itself could be extended. Perhaps death was not an inevitability at all, but a system failure waiting to be corrected by a sufficiently ruthless mind steeped in the dark side. On hidden laboratories scattered from Megiddo to remote, unregistered worlds, Plagueis began his trials. Mortally wounded subjects were brought to him, criminals, political enemies, even captured agents who had once served the light side. Where a healer might have offered comfort, the Muun Sith offered something else. He poured the dark side into their failing bodies, commanding their midichlorians to remain active, to keep cells dividing, organs functioning, hearts beating long after nature had given its verdict. What followed was a series of quiet horrors. Bodies that should have failed clung to existence, breathing in ragged, unnatural, a rhythm. Tissues refused to decay. Pain receptors flickered without pattern. Over time, Plagueis learned to refine the process, sustaining some subjects in a suspended twilight between life and death, an existence measured not in consciousness but in midichlorian activity. To him, these were proofs of concept. Each preserved heartbeat confirmed his belief that the Force could be bent, its most sacred boundary crossed. He spoke of death as a flaw in the design of reality, a defect that a true master of the dark side could edit out of galactic history. For thousands of years, the Sith had sought dominion through empires and war. Plagueis sought dominion over the very principle that made empires rise and fall. Yet beneath his growing confidence, a quieter question lingered, one even he rarely voiced. If the Force was an energy field created by all living things, what happened when one Sith began to tamper with the source of that life on a fundamental level? Was he merely exploiting a loophole or provoking a response from the Force itself? This was the pattern interrupt in an otherwise clinical pursuit, the possibility that the galaxy was not a passive laboratory, but a reactive organism. As his experiments deepened, strange ripples in the Force began to manifest, disturbances that even distant Jedi could sense without understanding. To Plagueis, they were promising side effects. To the cosmos, they may have been early warnings. Because in trying to command midichlorians, Darth Plagueis was no longer just studying life and death. He was tugging at the threads from which destiny itself was woven, setting in motion consequences that neither master nor apprentice could fully foresee. Quiet atrocities, case studies in Sith, experimentation in the wake of those first disturbances in the Force Plagueis withdrew even further from public view. Power corrupts. But what happens when that power is applied with the precision of a surgeon rather than the fury of a warrior? The answer was found on cold, forgotten worlds where his laboratories hummed in the dark on one such remote facility buried beneath the ice of Megiddo. The Muun maintained a hidden complex, accessible only through encrypted banking routes on the surface. It appeared to be a mundane corporate depot. Below it opened into a cathedral of containment fields, transparasteel slabs and humming life support frames. Medical droids glided between suspended bodies, monitoring vitals that no normal physician would recognize as life in this chamber. The story of Darth Plagueis became something far more intimate and far more terrifying. The centerpiece of his work was a single operating theater, ringed by sterile durasteel and silent droids here. Plagueis oversaw a controlled catastrophe. A condemned criminal from the Outer Rim was restrained and then systematically maimed organs, crushed arteries, severed neural tissue. Burned. What followed was not an execution, but an experiment at the brink of oblivion. As the body failed, Plagueis reached into the subject's bloodstream. With the Force commanding midichlorians to persist, he forced a ruined heart to beat without rhythm, kept shredded lungs exchanging air, and held a flickering consciousness suspended between agony and nothingness for hours to the subject. This was endless torment to Plagueis. It was data he observed the way midichlorians clustered around damaged tissue, how they responded when he flooded them with dark side intent. He recorded which commands extended awareness and which accelerated decay. Every scream became a metric, every convulsion a notation on a floating display. When the subject finally died, it was not mourned, it was archived over time. These experiments expanded beyond single victims. Entire rows of testbeds were devoted to disease. Plagueis infected captives with engineered plagues, then used the Force to slow and accelerate the spread at will. He watched cells bloom and wither under his influence, treating tumors and lesions as instruments to be tuned. He induced rapid aging in some subjects, compressing decades into days, while others were held in arrested development, their bodies frozen at a cellular level, even as their minds broke under the strain. In these quiet atrocities, Plagueis saw confirmation that life and death were negotiable contracts rather than absolutes. He believed that for the next 1,000 years, the Sith would not need crude superweapons if one master could simply refuse to die. Failure never discouraged him. It only revealed another variable to adjust another parameter. To refine his emotional detachment was complete to him. The distinction between a patient and a cadaver was merely a question of how responsive the midichlorians remained. Yet with each success came a deeper illusion. The belief that if he could chart every reaction and control every cell, he could also master his own fate. What they found there would change. Everything was not some hidden truth of the light side, but the growing conviction of a Sith Lord that destiny itself could be graphed and corrected, and that quiet certainty would shape the tragedies still to come. A new variable, the search for an apprentice. In the quiet aftermath of those experiments, another truth began to press in on Darth Plague. His power could map destiny, but it could not escape tradition. For thousands of years, the Sith had survived through a single, brutal equation master and apprentice. No matter how close he came to cheating death, he remained a product of that rule. The dark side demanded succession. Around this point in his ascent, Plagueis accepted that knowledge hoarded in one mind was knowledge waiting to be lost if his discoveries about midichlorians and immortality were to outlive his frail moon body. They had to be passed on, yet he had no interest in repeating the chaos of the old Sith Empire. This would not be the story of another warlord raising legions. It would be the careful selection of one successor who would shape the galactic future in silence. His criteria were merciless. Raw strength in the Force was only the beginning. The apprentice he imagined would move through public life as a shadow wrapped in courtesy, someone capable of debating trade law in a Senate chamber while contemplating murder, someone whose emotions ran deep enough to fuel the dark side, yet controlled enough to vanish behind a flawless mask. Political talent mattered as much as lightsaber skill. The next Sith Lord would need allies' votes and leverage, not just a blade over time. Plagueis turned his vast resources toward this search under the name Hego Damask. He already sat near the heart of the intergalactic banking clan. From there, he extended financial tendrils into corporate boards, noble houses and planetary courts. Every credit transfer became a data point, every investment a probe into character through secret intelligence networks and discreet Force impressions. He scanned ambitious bankers on Myjeto, governors on Eriadu, heirs on Corellia and Coruscant. Each candidate measured, then quietly dismissed. What followed was a methodical culling of possibilities. Some were strong in the Force, but blunt instruments. Others possessed keen intellect, but no true darkness. Plagueis wanted both a scalpel and a storm, a mind that could navigate the subtle conflicts of the Republic, while hiding a Sith will beneath layers of charm to him. The right apprentice would be tool and safeguard at once, a partner to enact his grand design, while he receded further into research, chasing the final secret of conquering death. In his private meditations, he imagined a future where the apprentice ruled the visible empire as chancellor or even emperor, while the master lingered unseen, a quiet, immortal presence guiding policy and war from the shadows. For the next 1,000 years, this vision comforted him. It promised continuity, a living shield against the unpredictability of galactic history. Yet destiny rarely matches design on a distant mid. Rim world, known more for pastoral vistas than power politics, lay an overlooked variable. Naboo, outwardly serene, inwardly simmering with class tension and rising ambition. Among its youth there walked a young man whose hunger and hatred ran deeper than Plagueis' most careful projections. Soon Hego Damask would visit Naboo on business, and what they found there would change everything. The boy from Naboo, first contact with Palpatine on Naboo power, did not announce itself with star destroyers or battle droids. It moved behind Senate robes and ancestral estates. The story of Darth Sidious begins here, not with a throne, but with a boy who hated the people who owned it. At the time of Hego Damask's first visit, the boy was known simply as Palpatine heir to a minor yet politically entangled noble house in Thid. Outwardly, he was everything Naboo promised in its young, a refined student of galactic history, gifted with rhetoric, dutiful in public ceremonies. Inwardly, his thoughts ran darker. He watched senators barter away, principle for influence, watched the Jedi appear in holofeeds as distant arbiters of justice, and he despised all of them for their restraint, their compromises, their smiles. Damask arrived as a financier, not a mystic. Officially, he represented the intergalactic banking clan, assessing Naboo's potential as a client world for investment and development in private. He sought something rarer than mineral wealth, a mind already at war with its own society. Their first meetings took place in polished offices overlooking Theed's waterfalls, framed as discussions about trade routes, taxation, and the planet's future place in the Republic. At first, Palpatine spoke cautiously, answering questions about governance and economics. Damask listened with the patience of a predator, then began to press where others never did. Were the senators truly serving the people, or only themselves? Did the Jedi's guardianship strengthen the Republic or freeze it in fear of decisive action? Slowly, what followed was a guided excavation of resentment. Damask praised Palpatine's insight when he criticized the Senate's paralysis. He nodded approvingly when the young man suggested that democracy could never move swiftly enough to prevent galactic catastrophe over time. The mask of the dutiful student slipped in Damask's presence. Palpatine spoke more openly of his contempt for the ruling classes of Naboo, of his belief that only concentrated, unquestioned power could end corruption. He questioned the light side as portrayed in Jedi doctrine, wondering aloud whether the Force itself might favor those willing to impose order rather than plead for consensus. Damask never contradicted him. Instead, he framed these thoughts as evidence of rare clarity. Only when Palpatine's hatred had been named and accepted did Damask shift the conversation from politics to something older. He spoke of an ancient tradition that rejected Jedi restraint, a lineage that had studied the dark side in secret. For thousands of years, he did not call it temptation. He called it honesty. The Sith, he explained, were those who refused to lie to themselves about their desire for domination and survival in a private suite far from Theed's public eye. Damask finally revealed his true nature as Darth Plagueis. He demonstrated the Force not with theatrics, but with precise, terrifying control. The air thickened. Palpatine's thoughts were laid bare, and the promise was made through the dark side. His ambitions need never be limited by law or lifespan. Palpatine accepted without hesitation. In that moment, the noble from Naboo became the apprentice. Darth Sidious. His political career would continue its respectable ascent, but beneath the marble of Theed and the polished floors of the Senate, a new Sith Lord began secret training that would shape the fate of the Republic and prepare the next phase of Plagueis's grand design. Forging Sidious. Training a master of masks, power corrupts. But what happens when that power is sharpened, both in the shadows and beneath the bright lights of the Senate? The answer is the apprenticeship of Darth Sidious under Darth Plague. What followed was not a simple training in the dark side, but the careful forging of a master of masks, a being who could disappear in the Force while standing at the center of galactic attention. In the years after their pact on Naboo, Plagueis constructed a dual curriculum for his new apprentice. On one level, the Muun Sith Lord drilled Sidious in rigorous dark side techniques, meditation in sensory deprivation chambers, control of rage until it could be summoned and dismissed at will, and the bending of pain into focus on another level. He tutored the young politician in rhetoric negotiation and the psychology of crowds and senators, how a pause could be as powerful as a promise, how fear could be framed as stability, and how a single well-placed rumor could topple a rival more efficiently than any lightsaber over time. Plagueis insisted that Palpatine become several men at once. In public, he would be the humble servant of Naboo, soft-spoken, deferential to the Chancellor and to the Jedi in committee rooms. He would be the loyal representative of his world, tirelessly arguing for funding and security. Yet beneath both faces, Plagueis cultivated the hidden Sith Lord Darth Sidious, a persona that felt no loyalty to titles or worlds, only to the dark side and to the ancient ambition of the Sith. This layering of identities would shape the future Emperor's every move. Plagueis tested these masks with ruthless precision. In private training sessions, he ordered Sidious to stand beside Jedi dignitaries while completely suppressing his presence in the Force, until even seasoned masters sensed nothing at all. He demanded flawless lies, delivered without the slightest tremor of emotion, then required his apprentice to go further to plant suggestions so subtly that targets believed the resulting decisions were their own. Ideas, a governor's sudden change of vote, a banker's unexpected loan, a senator's carefully timed outrage. Each became a lesson in invisible manipulation, convinced that knowledge would make his apprentice a more effective partner. Plagueis began to share fragments of his deepest research. He spoke of midichlorians whispering how they could be influenced to heal, to strengthen, even to defy death. He outlined experiments in which life had been nudged towards survival when it should have failed, hinting at an immortality that seemed almost within reach. For thousands of years, Sith had sought power through conquest. Plagueis promised a power over life itself and believed that this revelation would bind Sidious to him forever. Yet beneath this confidence lay the quiet seed of tragedy in granting Sidious such freedom to move through the Senate and such insight into his own secrets. Plagueis was unknowingly teaching his successor exactly how to surpass and destroy him. This was the story of a master certain he was securing his legacy, while in truth he was crafting the very weapon that would end his line. And the next phase of their grand design would show how completely the apprentice had learned the lesson. Engineering a senator, Naboo, elections and subtle corruption power in the Republic rarely arrived with marching armies and blazing cannons. More often it appeared in the quiet language of credits, trade routes and elections. The story of Plagueis and Sidious on Naboo was a lesson in how the dark side could move through polished halls and peaceful plazas without ever drawing a blade. Naboo stood as one of the Republic's most cultured worlds. Its people prided themselves on art philosophy and a politics built on service rather than ambition. Monarchs were elected, not born. The planetary senate was filled with idealists, and the Royal Advisory Council debated education and environmental protections more than war. In such a refined, peace-loving society, true Sith hunger for power seemed utterly out of place, almost impossible. Plagueis understood that this was precisely what would shape his strategy. Around 52 years before the Battle of Yavin, operating as Hego Damask, he approached Naboo not as a conqueror, but as an investor. Through the intergalactic banking clan, he arranged favorable loans for planetary infrastructure, new plasma processing facilities, expanded starports, and discrete off-world investment funds on paper. This was simple economic development. In reality, it created quiet dependencies. Naboo's prosperity began to hinge on credit lines that could be tightened or relaxed at will over time. Those dependencies became levers during local elections. Damask Holdings would fund cultural projects in certain districts, sponsor university scholarships, and underwrite trade delegations, all tied to politicians who happened to support a promising young aristocrat from feed senatorial candidate Palpatine when rivals opposed him. Subtle financial pressures appeared a delayed shipment here, an inexplicable increase in lending rates, then nothing that could be traced directly back to Plagueis, yet everything moved in the same direction. What followed was a carefully orchestrated ascent, crafted jointly by master and apprentice. Crises were never theatrical, they were administrative, a minor budget, shortfall blamed on an older official, a trade dispute with an off-world corporation. Quietly encouraged by Damask's contacts, each incident chipped away at Palpatine's competitors while leaving him positioned as the calm, reasonable alternative. At the same time, anonymous reports reached the press about small ethical lapses among his rivals. Nothing criminal, merely enough to stain reputations. Palpatine, by contrast, appeared unblemished, almost reluctant in his rise. There were no coups, no assassinations in the streets, only a series of small, precise adjustments over several election cycles. Palpatine won a seat in the Naboo legislature, then greater influence within the Royal Advisory Council, until finally, the path to representing Naboo in the Galactic Senate seemed not engineered, but inevitable. Citizens believed they had chosen the most capable voice for their world to plague. As this was the purest expression of Sith philosophy, power was most secure when others felt they had freely embraced the outcome he had designed for them. Yet beneath the polished veneer of Naboo's democracy, the dark side had already taken root, and the next move in their plan would show how that hidden root could tear an entire republic out of the ground, tilting the galaxy, trade routes, crises, and the coming storm from Naboo's polished plazas. The next phase of the plan reached outward into the cold geometry of star charts and shipping lanes. Power corrupted institutions, but what happened when that power flowed, not through armies or Jedi, but through invisible lines of commerce? The answer was control of hyperspace. For thousands of years, the Republic's prosperity had depended on a web of hyperspace routes that stitched the galactic disk together. Major arteries, such as the Polemian trade route and the Corellian run, carried food, medicine, raw materials, and culture from core to rim. Whoever influenced those lanes held leverage over entire sectors. A redirected convoy could ruin a world. An imposed toll could topple a government. In this quiet terrain of tariffs and transit clearances, Plagueis saw a battlefield more decisive than any war around this time. Hego Damask's reach within the intergalactic banking clan allowed him to touch that battlefield directly through front companies, shell holdings, and pliant executives. He began to engineer disputes between rival shipping cartels, a minor increase in interest rates here, a delayed refinancing of a corporate fleet. There, what followed was a pattern of manufactured strain. The Trade Federation found itself squeezed by debt, the Techno-Union tempted by predatory offers of capital. The Commerce Guild nudged into riskier security arrangements. Over time, these financial pressures spilled into open conflict. Plagueis and his agents encouraged regional governors to demand higher fees from passing freighters, then quietly funded local pirate groups to make those routes genuinely dangerous. In response, corporations hired private navies and petitioned the Senate for redress. The result was a wave of blockades, threatened embargoes, and security zones declared along key hyperspace lanes. Each incident seemed contained a dispute over tolls in one sector, a labor action on a shipyard world in another. Yet together, they strained the Republic's ability to arbitrate within the Senate chamber. The story of these crises took on another shape. Their Senator Palpatine of Naboo presented himself as a calm, reasonable voice. He condemned excess on both sides, urging compromise, stability, and adherence to law in private. Guided by his Sith master, he amplified the very tensions he publicly lamented. He steered committees toward half measures that inflamed resentment. He drafted resolutions that appeared neutral yet favored further corporate militarization. Every speech of restraint concealed a quiet push toward greater instability. The pattern became unmistakable. To those few who studied galactic history, closely trust in the Senate eroded as worlds watched trade disputes drag on for years. Resolved only when corporations deployed force instead of legislation. Faith in the Jedi dimmed. When peacekeepers sent to mediate found themselves constrained by politics and by their own code. To many citizens, the Republic seemed ancient, distant, and powerless. This was no accident. It was design, and then came the pattern: interrupt a single world placed under full blockade. Naboo, presented as an isolated outrage. In truth, it was a scaled-up version of earlier experiments, a public test of methods refined in the shadows, and it hinted at something larger on the horizon: the slow destabilization of trade, law, and faith in institutions would shape the galaxy's response when a manufactured war finally arrived, a war that would justify extraordinary powers and bring the old order to an end. The grand experiment, unbalancing the force itself. In the quiet that followed those manufactured crises, another project unfolded, one far more dangerous than any trade dispute or senatorial scandal. While the galactic public argued over tariffs and security acts, two Sith Lords turned their attention to the fabric of existence itself. Their question was simple and terrible. If the Force bound all life, could it be bent not just in moments of passion, but on a scale that would shape an entire era? Around this time, as Palpatine's influence in the Senate grew, Plagueis drew his apprentice into ever deeper secrecy. Away from courts and committees, they convened in hidden laboratories on Coruscant, in fortified retreats on Midichlorians, and in remote facilities owned by the intergalactic banking clan there. The mask of Hego Damask fell away, and the story of Darth Plagueis became something closer to a scientist of the dark side, testing the limits of creation and decay. What followed was a series of rituals that fused Sith sorcery with clinical experimentation. Plagueis had long studied Midichlorians, those microscopic symbionts that allowed beings to touch the Force earlier. Sith had treated them as a mystery to be exploited in the moment. Plagueis sought a systemic answer. He and Sidious meditated over entire star systems, reaching with their will into the invisible web of life. They tried to suppress natural death in some regions and intensify decay in others. Their goal was no longer the salvation of a single favored servant, but a gradual tipping of the cosmic scales toward the dark side. Over time, the galaxy itself seemed to respond. Jedi healers reported strange disturbances. Patients who should have died clung to life through inexplicable surges, while others failed without. Clear cause visions among the Jedi Council grew more fragmented. The light side felt veiled as if an unseen pressure was pushing against it. In Legend's accounts, Plagueis believed this was proof of success, the dark side thickening around the Republic as his apprentice's political net tightened. From this period emerges one of the most debated theories in Star Wars history, the idea that the concentrated pressure of Plagueis and Sidious upon the living force provoked a counterstroke far from Coruscant on the desert world of Tatooine. A slave woman named Shmi Skywalker carried a child conceived with no father. Some traditions whisper that Plagueis had attempted to create life directly through midichlorian manipulation, and that Anakin was the unintended result. Others suggest the opposite, that the Force in self-defense generated a champion of balance in response to the Sith experiment. Either way, the timing is difficult to ignore as the Republic slid toward manufactured war and the Sith. Empire of one Chancellor. Palpatine took shape. The boy who would become Darth Vader was born in obscurity. The quiet question lingers: did Plagueis, in seeking dominion over life and death, set in motion the birth of the very being destined to destroy his Sith legacy? And if so, what would happen when Master and unintended consequence finally brushed against each other through the currents of the Force? Not so wise. Plagueis's blind spots and miscalculations in the quiet currents of the Force, where destinies brush against each other. The greatest dangers are not always distant empires or ancient weapons. Sometimes the most lethal threat sits across the table, sharing a plan and a toast. The story of Darth Plagueis in this phase is the story of a master who believed he had outgrown the very warnings that defined his order for thousands of years. The rule of two had been brutally simple. There is a master and an apprentice, one to embody power and one to crave it. It was not a suggestion, it was a safeguard built from endless Sith betrayal. Yet Plagueis treated the rule less as a prophecy of inevitable conflict and more as a technicality to be optimized. He viewed Darth Sidious not as a future rival, but as an extension of his will, a perfect instrument to reshape the galactic order. Over time, this perspective hollowed out the meaning of the rule. In Plagueis's mind, he told himself that by binding Sidious through shared secrets, through financial networks, through the rising political machine on Naboo, he had solved the ancient problem of Sith treachery. The apprentice would not need to overthrow the master. If both shared the same grand design in this, there was a quiet arrogance. Plagueis believed doctrine could be outthought and that the dark side itself could be managed. His gaze turned ever more towards systems and abstractions. Midichlorians became equations. Economies became levers. Senates and corporations became pieces on a board he could move at will. What followed was a deepening blindness to the raw personal hatred that defined his apprentice. While Plagueis measured blood counts and market fluctuations, Sidious nurtured something far simpler and far more dangerous, a private hunger to stand alone as the Dark Lord of a new Sith Empire. There were moments when the facade slipped, when Sidious's independence was visible to an outside observer. Sidious cultivated his own network. On Coruscant spoke in veiled terms with allies. Plagueis had not fully vetted and disappeared for stretches under the pretense of political duties. Each could have been a warning instead. Plagueis rationalized every sign. The master convinced himself that any risk was manageable, that his intellect and financial reach would shape every outcome. Beneath this complacency lay another miscalculation, his obsession with immortality. Plagueis believed that mastery over life and death granted him time and options. Even in hypothetical conflict with his apprentice, he imagined contingencies. Hidden laboratories, secret techniques, the ability to return from any setback if death itself could be delayed. Then betrayal could be endured and corrected. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history, in his mind not through compassion, but through the refusal to ever relinquish control. And yet, in focusing on eternity, he missed the immediate. In perfecting the manipulation of midichlorians, he failed to read the expression on the face across from him. The Sith, renowned for forbidden wisdom, could not see the simplest truth that the apprentice at his side was already planning the final betrayal. The night that plan unfolds begins with celebration and ends with silence, and the next section will follow Sidious into that darkness. The Phantom Menace. From Plagueis' plan to Sidious's war, power reveals weakness, but what happens when that power is tested, not on a battlefield, but through trade routes, tariffs, and procedural votes in a distant Senate chamber? The answer is the trade. Federation crisis over Naboo, the quiet ignition of a galactic war designed in the shadows of the Sith. By the time Republic scouts recorded the first hint of trouble in the Shomel sector, the story of that blockade was already years old under Hego Damask's guidance. Plagueis had spent decades reshaping the galactic economy through the intergalactic banking clan. He extended predatory credit to the Trade Federation, encouraged their droid armies, and brokered legal immunities in the Senate. What followed was a subtle strangling of smaller worlds through fees and monopolies. Naboo, rich in plasma and politically symbolic, became the perfect pressure point. Around the moment the Federation's battleships locked into position over Theed, Sidious was not improvising. He was executing a script Plagueis had helped outline: the taxation of trade routes, the Neimoidians' paranoia, their dependence on droid soldiers, and legal loopholes. All of it flowed from long conversations about how to bend the Republic without firing a single honest shot. This conflict over Naboo would shape how the Senate thought about security, sovereignty, and emergency authority. For Plagueis, watching reports of the blockade and the Jedi dispatch from secure vantage points on Coruscant, the crisis looked like validation. The Republic responded slowly, the Jedi were constrained by politics, and corporate powers acted with near impunity over time. This was exactly what he had predicted: a Republic rotted by complacency, ready to accept strong guidance from a single decisive leader. He believed that leader would be his apprentice, guided by his own immortal hand. Sidious, however, treated Naboo as a laboratory. He measured the Jedi by how easily they were diverted, the Senate by how quickly it became mired in procedure, and Queen Amidala by how far desperation would push a pacifist monarch when she called for a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum. Sidious saw more than a political upset. She saw proof that a manufactured crisis could topple the highest office in the Republic without open war. Here, the divergence between master and apprentice sharpened. Though both Sith had engineered this moment, they did not share the same destination. Plagueis thought in centuries, and in terms of shared ascension, he imagined Sidious as Chancellor, while he himself mastered the dark side of the Force to conquer death. Together, they would rule an eternal Sith empire. Sidious envisioned something colder in his private meditations. The future Emperor stood alone. No Muun banking magnate, no hidden master, no divided throne. The night Palpatine became Chancellor-elect on Coruscant would not be a joint coronation. It would be the turning of a key, a celebration in the Senate, a triumph for Plagueis' plan, and, unseen beneath the music and applause, the moment their paths finally and fatally split. The night on Coruscant, triumph and intoxication. Power promises clarity, but what happens when that promise is finally fulfilled, when every piece falls into place? The answer is a night on Coruscant that feels less like politics and more like destiny on the Ecumenopolis world city. The announcement spread in waves across Durasteel canyons and kilometer-high towers. Palpatine of Naboo had been chosen as Chancellor-elect. The galactic core responded in the only way it knew how. With light, sound, and motion, the senatorial districts blazed with banners and hovering hollows projecting the new Chancellor's calm features over the endless traffic streams. Fireworks burst between spires, scattering color across rain-glossed transparasteel bridges. For a Republic exhausted by scandal and deadlock, this seemed a turning point, a new hope rising from the same old Senate rotunda, far above the skylanes, above the roar of speeders and the chant of crowds. A single luxurious apartment looked down on the celebration from a place of near-silent remove. The residence was appointed in understated opulence. Deep carpets, muted lighting artwork collected from a dozen worlds. Its broad, transparent steel windows framed Coruscant's nightscape as an ocean of stars turned upside down the soundproofing, and thick walls rendered the distant festivities as nothing more than a faint vibration through the floor here. Behind locked doors, Master and apprentice withdrew from the public theatre. What followed was not the jubilant chaos of the Senate Hall, but a controlled, almost ceremonial unwinding for Plagueis. This was the culmination of decades of planning patient manipulation of the intergalactic banking clan, the financing of crises that had steered votes and careers, the careful grooming of a gifted politician from Naboo. Now at last the Sith held the office that would shape the fate of Jedi and Republic alike. Plagueis moved through the rooms with a rare ease, the tall Muun unburdened for once by the constant tension of contingency. His respirator purred softly as he poured expensive wine into crystal glasses. The drink flowed more freely than on other nights, the master of life and death allowing himself to be merely mortal. For a few hours, he spoke of consolidation, of how, over time, the emergency powers of the Chancellorship could be expanded, of how the dark side imbalance they had nurtured would be refined, not risked. He believed Sidious securely bound shared secrets, shared crimes, shared vision. This was the story of two Sith standing at the threshold of an empire. Yet in the dim and the light, the contrast between them deepened. Plagueis relaxed in his chair, elongated features softened by intoxication, confident that the next phase would be devoted to perfecting his experiments on the Force and finally stabilizing the immortality he craved. Sidious listened, attentive, deferential. The model apprentice outside, the galaxy celebrated a savior inside. The architect of that savior's rise lowered his guard with every unmeasured sip in that quiet room, with coruscant storm. Of light sealed away by transparasteel, the oldest Sith tradition waited patiently. The master, who had spent a lifetime learning to cheat, death had entered the one arena where the dark side offered no second chances. The night seemed to promise the next 1,000 years of Sith dominion. Instead, it would end with a single, silent choice that no one in the cheering crowds below would ever see. Murder in his sleep. The death of Darth Plagueis' power promises certainty, but in the end it often delivers only silence. In the high suite above the festival, the story of Darth Plagueis narrowed from galactic schemes and ancient doctrines to a single, private moment. What followed was not a duel of legends, but a quiet surrender to exhaustion that would shape everything to come. The night had been long. The Muun Sith Lord, Hego Damask to the galaxy, and Darth Plagueis to the dark side, sat heavily in his chair, the air rich with the scent of expensive wine and victory. The Republic was snared. The Jedi were blind, and his apprentice had been nominated to the highest office in the government. His elongated limbs felt heavy, his head clouded, as drink and age settled over him. Trust, a rare and dangerous luxury for the Sith, slipped in at the edges. He believed Sidious would watch over their shared future while he rested. Over time, his breathing slowed. The force that had once blazed through his cells like a storm now pulsed dully, muffled by intoxication and the smug certainty of success. Across from him, Palpatine, Darth Sidious, remained awake, eyes half-lidded, the image of a dutiful apprentice keeping vigil. In truth, he was waiting, listening for the subtle change in rhythm as Plagueis' consciousness drifted from wary wakefulness into vulnerable sleep. This was not the clash of blades many imagine when thinking of Sith succession. It was clinical, calculated. When the moment came, Sidious did not move from his seat. He reached out through the Force, not with the wild fury of battle, but with the precision of a surgeon. Invisible pressure closed around Plagueis' chest, constricting lungs that had drawn breath for decades. Another twist of will disrupted the steady cadence of his heart, turning ordered life into stuttering chaos. No lightning, no shouted challenge, only the quiet, relentless denial of breath. Plagueis stirred, half-conscious, instincts struggling to surface. This was the master who had studied Midichlorians, who had bent the mechanisms of life and death to his purpose, who had dreamed of a Sith empire that might endure for thousands of years. Yet in this final instant, his connection to the Force was dulled, his body slow to respond, his mind slipping between dreams and realization. By the time awareness fully returned, the damage was already done. There was no dramatic counterattack, no brilliant escape. The irony was absolute. A Sith Lord who had devoted his existence to conquering mortality died not in war, not at the hands of a Jedi champion, but in an almost mundane act of betrayal. Suffocation in the dark, on a night of celebration, with no witness but the murderer. What they found there would change everything was not some secret technique of immortality, but the simple truth that the rule of two ended as it always had, with the apprentice choosing power over loyalty. When it was over, Sidious stood at last. Behind him, Plagueis' body cooled in the dim light, the moon's long features frozen in an unfinished thought. Before him stretched the future, a galactic conflict already set in motion, clone armies and Jedi generals marching toward a war they did not understand. For the next 1,000 years was the span he now imagined, an unbroken Sith dominion with himself at the center. Yet even as he left that silent room, another presence was already stirring in the Force, a variable his careful murder had not accounted for. And the next chapter of the Sith's long history waited just beyond the horizon. A legend told in a box, Sidious remembers his master. In the years that followed, that unseen presence in the Force would grow into a young man seated in a dim, echoing chamber of art and spectacle. Power corrupts, but what happens when that power is offered not as tyranny, but as salvation from death itself? The answer unfolds in the Mon Calamari Opera House above Coruscant, where a Chancellor and a Jedi Knight speak softly while the galaxy edges toward war. The setting is almost otherworldly. Around them, the Mon Calamari ballet drifts through columns of levitating water, translucent aquatic forms spiraling through the air as if the ocean has been lifted into the sky. The lighting is low and restless, casting long shadows over tiers of private boxes. In one of those boxes sits Palpatine, the public face of the Republic, with Anakin Skywalker alone beside him. The distant music hums through the structure, but their conversation is hushed, intimate, insulated from the roar of galactic conflict. It is here that Palpatine chooses to unseal an old story. He does not announce it as Sith lore or forbidden history. Instead, in a calm, almost casual tone, he begins with a phrase that would shape Anakin's destiny. Did you ever hear the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise? What follows was not a full biography, but a carefully curated legend. Palpatine speaks of a Sith Lord so powerful and so wise he could use the Force to influence the Midichlorians to create life, to keep the ones he cared about from dying. He emphasizes only two things: power over death and betrayal. Plagueis, he says, could save others from death, but not himself. His apprentice killed him in his sleep. The irony is presented as a dark parable about the nature of the Sith, but the most important detail is the one left unspoken. Palpatine never admits that he is that apprentice, that the man telling the story of the wise master is the murderer who ended him. In that omission lies the true manipulation. Palpatine turns his own crime into both a warning and a promise. On the surface, it is a cautionary tale about trusting the dark side and the inevitability of betrayal among the Sith. Beneath that surface, it is pure temptation. If Plagueis learned this power, then perhaps his apprentice inherited it. If the apprentice lives, then perhaps that knowledge can be shared. The hook is simple. The power to prevent death might be available if Anakin is willing to abandon the light side. Over time, this quiet exchange would be remembered as the moment the mask slipped. Yet in the scene itself, Palpatine remains the concerned statesman. He speaks of the Jedi as dogmatic, of the Sith as merely another tradition of the Force. Plagueis becomes his example, a tool, a myth sharpened into bait for a new, more powerful apprentice. In that box, Plagueis no longer exists as a moon banker, a scientist of the dark side, or an architect of galactic schemes. He exists only as the story of a shadowy figure who could cheat death and then failed at the final test. Decades of planning, experiments, and secret influence are compressed into a few whispered lines, repackaged by the very man who smothered him. The master, who dreamed of immortality, survives only as a legend told in the dark, a bedtime tragedy for the chosen instrument of his killer, and the next chapter of Sith history moves quietly into place. Echoes in the Clone Wars, Plagueis' shadow on the galaxy. The master is gone, but the machine he helped build is still running. Power in the galaxy rarely dies with a single life. It lingers in institutions, in debts, in laws written in quiet rooms. The story of Darth Plagueis does not end with his murder on Coruscant. It echoes through a war he never lived to see. Decades before clone troopers marched and Jedi became generals, Plagueis had already begun rearranging the galactic economy. Operating as Hego Damask of the intergalactic banking clan, he cultivated dependencies, pushed worlds into carefully managed debt, and encouraged corporate cartels to step beyond mere commerce. Over time, banking interests, shipping combines, and arms manufacturers learnt that the Senate could be pressured and that the Jedi would not intervene in purely financial disputes. What followed was a subtle shift. Money became a weapon as sharp as any lightsaber. Around the same period, Plagueis and his apprentice quietly tied the banking clan, the Trade Federation, and other corporate powers into overlapping webs of obligation. Loans were extended on favorable terms, then recalled at critical moments. Trade disputes were inflamed, not resolved. When the Trade Federation blockaded Naboo, it was not an isolated crisis. It was a test case in turning economic leverage into open conflict. Plagueis had spent years proving that the Republic's peace could be undermined through contracts and credit ratings rather than open war. By the time of the Clone Wars, Sidious did not need to invent new systems. He simply accelerated and weaponized those Plagueis had already shaped. The banking clan, conditioned to profit from instability, funded both the Republic and the Separatists, turning every battle into interest payments and balance sheets. The Trade Federation, long entangled in backroom deals, provided fleets and droid armies under the same legal frameworks that once governed shipping routes. Legislative loopholes Plagueis had quietly encouraged became the channels through which emergency powers flowed. In the Senate, the pattern was the same. Years of manufactured gridlock and orchestrated scandals had eroded trust in normal procedure. When crisis came, senators reached instinctively for extraordinary measures. Each new emergency vote strengthened the Chancellor's hand, transforming procedural weaknesses into dictatorial authority. The Jedi, bound to serve the Republic, found themselves drawn into a galactic war whose financial and political foundations had been laid by a Muun who never wore armor or raised a blade on the battlefield. Plagueis did not live to watch the first clones deploy or to see the temple burn. Yet his fingerprints are present in the banking clan's double-dealing, in the Trade Federation's fearful compliance, in a Senate that had already surrendered its will before it surrendered its power. He becomes an unseen architect of the conflict that destroys the Republic and breaks the Jedi Order. In this, his legacy fulfills a Sith ideal, a dark side influence that endures beyond flesh. A Sith Lord can die in a quiet room, yet the ideas and systems he leaves behind would shape galactic history for thousands of years, carrying his shadow forward into the age of the Empire. Did he create the Chosen One? The Anakin question. And yet, for all that invisible influence, one quiet question hangs over Darth Plagueis more than any other. In trying to command life and death, did this Muun Sith Lord call the Chosen One into being, or did the Force answer his arrogance in its own way? The answer lies in the murky space between canon, legend, and myth. Officially, the story of Anakin Skywalker begins on the desert world of Tatooine with a slave boy born to Shmi Skywalker with no biological father. The Jedi sense an unprecedented concentration of Midichlorians, and some declare him the chosen one of prophecy. But in the shadows, another explanation emerges. Plagueis had been conducting vast experiments, reaching out through the Force to command Midichlorians, to bend the very spark of life across the galactic scale. Over time, these efforts created an imbalance. In legends, it is suggested that Plagueis and Sidious together pressed so hard on the dark side that the Force itself recoiled. If the Sith sought to prevent death and even create life, then the light side answered with a singular correction. According to this view, Anakin's conception was not their seemed triumph, but the universe's response, a living counterweight to a Sith empire, still hidden but already coiling around the Republic. There is another interpretation. Some accounts hint that Plagueis may have consciously attempted to engineer a being of unprecedented power, a perfect vessel for the dark side. His research into manipulating embryos, into guiding midichlorians to spark or extinguish life, suggests a mind willing to reach into the most intimate workings of the Force. In that reading, Anakin becomes an unintended consequence of a targeted experiment, the misfired product of a Sith Lord reaching too far. And then there is Sidious. In the Opera House on Coruscant, he speaks of Plagueis the Wise, a master who could influence the midichlorians to create life, who could keep those he cared about from dying. But Sidious is a manipulator. He shapes stories as easily as he shapes wars. It is entirely possible that he exaggerated his master's abilities or even claimed his legacy to seduce Anakin with the promise of forbidden power. What followed was a tale designed to sound both ancient and intimate, blurring truth and myth until they were indistinguishable. Symbolically, though, the idea remains haunting. A Sith Lord, in trying to control life and death, may have set in motion the birth of the one who would ultimately destroy the very Sith Order he helped perfect. If Anakin is the Force's answer, then Plagueis is the question, a being whose quest for control summons his own undoing. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history, not through Plagueis saving anyone, but through the Force sending a savior he could never anticipate. Canon and legends diverge, sources contradict, and the record is full of gaps. That uncertainty is part of Plagueis' allure. Whether or not he literally created Anakin, his research, his teachings, and his alliance with Sidious undeniably would shape the conditions of the Clone Wars, the fall of the Jedi, and the Empire's rise. Through that chain of events comes Anakin's fall into darkness, and eventually his return to the light side. The question that remains is not only whether Plagueis made the chosen one, but how deeply his unseen hand reaches into the fate of the Skywalker line and the next turn of the dark side cycle. If he had lived, alternate futures of Darth Plagueis' power promises control, but what happens when even death is treated as another system to be managed? The answer for Darth Plagueis was a future in which nothing meaningful escaped his design, not the Sith, not the Republic, not the very currents of the Force itself. In one possible strand of the story of the Sith, he notices the danger. The Muun on the bed is not as drunk as he seems. The master behind the mask of Hego Damask senses the dark side coiling around his apprentice. In that future, the poison fails. The attack is turned, and what followed was not a quiet suffocation, but a confrontation between two visions of power. Plagueis, cold and clinical, would not simply destroy Sidious. He would attempt to break and reprogram him, to turn the theatrical politician into a perfectly obedient instrument of a hidden empire. In that scenario, the question becomes simple. Would Sidious be allowed to rule openly as emperor or merely perform the role? Everything in Plagueis' history suggests an answer. For years, he preferred to move funds, not fleets, to sign decrees, not lead charges. He built influence in the intergalactic banking clan, installed Palpatine in the Senate, and remained a shadow. Over time, his pattern is clear. Systems over spectacle, markets and midichlorians over parades and banners. In a surviving timeline, he almost certainly permits an empire to rise, but insists that Sidious remain the mask, while the true sovereign continues his research in the dark. Another strand runs even darker. Imagine Plagueis succeeds in his experiments, stabilizes his manipulation of life and death, and achieves the immortality he sought. An immortal master standing behind an immortal empire has little use for an apprentice whose primary skill is galactic theater. In that slow future, Palpatine becomes obsolete. Plagueis would begin to see him as a noisy variable in an otherwise elegant equation, a creature of war and conflict in an age he intends to freeze. A new apprentice, perhaps bred for obedience, or no apprentice at all. Rule alone, forever. Here the pattern interrupt appears. For thousands of years the Sith repeated cycles of betrayal, yet Plagueis almost tried to end even that. His belief in managed control extended to the rule of two itself. He dreamed of a Sith lineage that no longer needed constant murder to renew itself. What they found there would change everything is usually said of explorers, but in his case, it applies to equations. In seeking to cage the dark side, he underestimated raw, theatrical evil, the very quality that made Sidious indispensable and deadly. None of those futures came to pass. There was no open duel, no eternal laboratory, no frozen empire with a silent Muun at its center. Instead, the last night of Darth Plagueis ended in a quiet room on Coruscant, his breath slowing as the apprentice he had elevated drank in his secrets and his power. His grand designs were not erased. They were absorbed, compressed into a sharper, crueler point. Sidious kept the banking networks, the Clone Wars, the engineered fall of the Jedi, but stripped away his master's restraint. In the end, the story of Darth Plagueis is not the tale of an immortal ruler, but of a planner who taught the galaxy's greatest Sith everything he needed to surpass him, and then closed his eyes forever as the dark side moved on without him. Was he truly not wise? Rethinking Plagueis' tragedy, power promises safety, but in Sith hands that promise is always a lie. The story of Darth Plagueis is often reduced to a joke about a master who was not wise, snoring his way into an assassin's blade. Yet beneath that irony lies a question worth dwelling on in the dark. How unwise was he truly? In the centuries-spanning history of the Sith, few minds were as disciplined as Plagueis. As Hego Damask of the intergalactic banking clan, he quietly bent galactic finance to his will, turning credit streams into conduits of power. Through patient acquisitions on worlds such as Midichlorians and Naboo, he learned that in an age of Republic law, currency could achieve what fleets and open war could not. Over time, his strategic vision would shape the conditions that allowed a Sith Lord to seize the Chancellorship without a single public duel. Beyond politics and banking, Plagueis pushed the Force itself to the brink. In hidden laboratories, he probed Midichlorians, seeking to command the boundary between life and death. What followed was a series of dangerous experiments, suffusing the galaxy with a dark side imbalance, so profound that some traditions whispered it helped call Anakin Skywalker into existence. In this sense, Plagueis stood at the threshold of the greatest Sith victory, a republic rotting from within, a Jedi Order blind, and a chosen pawn born into the exact storm he had helped create. Yet for all this brilliance, his perception failed at the point closest to him. Plagueis saw Sidious as an instrument, a razor he had honed, not a rival with a will of his own. He believed that knowledge, technique, and his unique understanding of the Force insulated him from the oldest Sith danger. In training a politician rather than a warrior, he assumed he had selected a servant of his grand design, not the architect of his downfall. Here, the rule of two revealed its cruel geometry. For thousands of years, it had ensured that every Sith master raised a successor who would one day test their strength. By design, each generation trained the very hand that would end it. Plagueis imagined himself the exception, a master who would transcend the cycle through shared immortality with his apprentice. Instead, he fulfilled the pattern perfectly, proving that the rule of two is less a guideline than a built-in trap. The deepest irony is that in seeking to conquer death, Plagueis ignored the simplest law of Sith history. Power invites challenge, and trust is always a wager. He rearranged empires, rewrote doctrine, and dissected the Force, but he never truly accepted that he was still a character in a much older story. His tragedy does not spring from stupidity, but from a lack of humility. He understood almost everything, except that the dark side does not grant exemptions, and that even the greatest planner can become just another stepping stone on the path to a greater empire of shadow yet to come. A thread through time. Plagueis and the unbroken Sith line. In every age, there are those who believe they stand above history, but the Force has a long memory. The story of Darth Plagueis only makes sense when placed back into the current that began with the very first fall from the light side. Around 7,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Jedi Schism shattered a unified order. Ambitious mystics embraced the dark side, turned the Force into a weapon of conquest, and plunged the galaxy into the 100-year darkness. Despite their newfound power, the Dark Jedi ultimately lost their war. Cast out beyond the Republic's borders, they drifted until they reached a desolate world called Korriban. What they found there would change everything. Among the red sands and funeral pyramids of the native Sith species, exile met opportunity, and what followed was the birth of the first true Sith Empire. For thousands of years, that empire rose and fell in waves of conflict. Lords such as Ajuntapal, Marka Ragnos, Naga Sado, and later Tulak Horde built regimes on fear, sorcery, and open war with the Republic. Each time the Sith seemed extinct, a remnant survived. Vichyo's hidden empire in the unknown regions, Freeden Nad's dark dynasty on Onderon, Exar Kun's crusade, Revan's Jedi civil war, the triumvirate that tried to erase the Force itself. Over time, defeat taught the Sith a harsh lesson. Direct confrontation invited annihilation. 1,000 years before Plagueis, Darth Bane answered that lesson with the rule of two. One master, one apprentice, no armies, no public empire. Power would pass in a single line, distilled through betrayal. For the next 1,000 years, that line endured in shadow, adapting to a republic that believed the Sith destroyed. Every master added a thread to the design: Xana's subtlety, Cognis's patience, Tenebrous' cold rationalism. Plagueis stepped into this inheritance as both mystic and financier. As Hego Damask of the intergalactic banking clan, he moved trillions of credits while, in secret, he searched Korriban's tombs and ancient holocrons. In him, the old and the new Sith converged. He studied rituals whispered in the catacombs of Ziost, then used modern corporate law to strangle worlds without firing a shot. Ancient sorcery met modern finance. Open conquest gave way to invisible leverage applied in Senate chambers and boardrooms on Coruscant. His work would shape more than his own lifetime. Through Sidious, his chosen apprentice, Plagueis' experiments with imbalance in the Force, with life, death, and midichlorians, echoed forward into the birth of Anakin Skywalker and the destruction of the Jedi. Even after Sidious murdered him, the line did not break. It curved through an emperor robed in statecraft and terror, and then, briefly, through Darth Vader, a Sith Lord bound in armor who embodied both the promise and the failure of Plagueis' dream of control. Seen from a distance, the Sith become an unbroken thread of darkness woven through galactic history. From the first exiles on Korriban to the throne room of the second Death Star, Plagueis is not the beginning of that thread, nor its end, but one of its most quietly influential weavers, tightening the pattern until it threatened to strangle the Republic itself. Yet in the moment of apparent victory, another shift began, a subtle tremor in the Force that no banker, no prophet of immortality fully accounted for. Drifting into sleep, the Sith, the Force, and endless cycles. In that tremor, the life of Darth Plagueis begins to loosen its grip on the present and drift backward into memory. The story of this Muun from the frozen vaults of Magito becomes less a sharp line of events and more a pattern traced across the wider tapestry of Sith history, Born among ice-crusted spires and crystalline battlefields, he rose not as a warrior king, but as a financier, a quiet architect of credit flows and debt chains, who learned early that in a galactic civilization, power often moved fastest where numbers changed on unseen ledgers. Yet behind the mask of Hego Damask, there stood a secret. Apprentice, shaped in the shadow of Darth Tenebrous, trained not amid roaring armies, but in hidden laboratories and forgotten vaults. As he grew into his title of Dark Lord Plagueis, is turned inward where others sought thrones. He sought equations where others perfected the killing stroke. He studied the breath between heartbeats. He listened to the murmur of Midichlorians and resolved that the dark side would no longer merely end lives. It would command them over time. His work would shape far more than his own fate. Plagueis reinterpreted the rule of two, not as a chain of rivals, but as a laboratory of succession master and apprentice, not only plotting against each other, but also combining their strength to wound the Force itself together with the young Naboo aristocrat he named Darth Sidious. He bent markets and elections, arranged blockades and trade disputes, and quietly prepared a clone war before a single trooper existed on Kamino. But even this intricate ascent is only one verse in a longer refrain. The Sith for thousands of years have moved in cycles of hunger and collapse. Empires rising from Korriban Ziost, Dromund Kaas, and later from the glittering ecumenopolis of Coruscant, each sworn to break the old pattern, each convinced that this time the dark would endure forever. And what followed was always the same: a surge of conquest, a golden age of fear, then fracture, betrayal, and ruin as master and apprentice repeated the same lethal conversation in different tongues. Beneath all of this, the Force remains a quieter constant than any creed. While Plagueis probed its deepest currents, searching for the secret of unending consciousness, the Force answered in subtler ways, balancing surges of darkness with fragile sparks of light. Side resistance. Jedi orders rose, waned and rebuilt. The names of councils and chancellors changed until they blurred. Yet the current moved on, indifferent to titles, indifferent even to legends of life created without parentage. Eventually, even the most shocking experiments fade into distant rumor. The Muun child of Mijito, the secret apprentice in Tenebrous's shadow, the scientist of the dark side, who whispered to cells and stars, the maker of systems, who helped birth a clone war, and finally, the victim of the very tradition that taught him to sleep beside his greatest enemy. All of it softens at the edges, as if remembered through half-closed eyes. In that softening, the conflicts of Sith and Jedi shrink to ripples on a much deeper ocean. Each Dark Lord, each fallen knight, a brief disturbance on the surface before the water stills again. In that stillness, it becomes easier to rest with the idea of endless cycles, knowing that even the greatest empires are temporary, that even the darkest war is a passing storm, and that somewhere beneath the noise, the galaxy continues to turn, the Force continues to flow, and the long night between stories waits patiently for dreams. A final whisper, remembering Darth Plagueis as you drift off in that quiet. Turning of the galaxy, one more name lingers a little longer before it fades. Darth Plagueis the Muun, who hid behind the face of Hego Damask, a financier from the frozen world of Mijito, a figure glimpsed in a single tale, told in half shadow and half rumor. In the opera box above Coruscant, the story of Plagueis is the story of a patient Sith who tried to do what no empire, no Jedi council, no war ever could. He tried to conquer death itself through the Force. He studied midichlorians in secret laboratories. He bent the dark side towards cells and pulses and breath. He believed that with enough control, with enough focus, he could decide who lived and who did not. And what followed was a lifetime spent chasing that invisible thread between life and oblivion. Over time, his methods grew colder and more precise. He reinterpreted the rule of two, not as a chain of rivals, but as a delicate instrument, a master and an apprentice working in concert to reshape galactic destiny. In public, he moved credits and influence through the intergalactic banking clan. In private, He whispered to a gifted youth on Naboo, guiding a rising politician who would one day be called Darth Sidious. For thousands of years, the Sith had waged open conflict against the Jedi, raising fleets and armies. Plagueis chose a quieter path. He preferred balance sheets to battlefields, elections to open war. Yet beneath that restraint, his ambition was vaster than most Dark Lords. He dreamed of a galaxy where the Sith ruled forever because death itself had been tamed, where the dark side would shape not only empires, but the very boundary between existence and nothingness. Yet, in the end, his fall did not come with a duel over a burning world. There was no last stand, no storm of sabers and lightning. Instead, there was a private celebration on Coruscant, a night when plans had finally aligned, when the Republic and the Jedi stood on the edge of a carefully arranged precipice, and Plagueis allowed himself to rest certain that his work was complete. He slept, and his apprentice watched, and the master who sought to deny death was quietly murdered in his own bed. That contrast between boundless ambition and such a small ending settles best as a distant thought rather than a sharp wound. The Muun, who tried to command the Force at the level of atoms reduced to a still body. In a high rise, the most dangerous Sith scientist in galactic history, undone by the very apprentice he had crafted over the long sweep of Sith history. Plagueis becomes one more thread in an unbroken fabric of darkness, not the first to chase immortality, not the last to be betrayed, but perhaps one of the most intricate. His legacy now is not an army or a banner, but a story told in the dark, a whispered legend about a master who could save others from death, but not himself. Somewhere far from this moment, that legend might invite a quieter reflection. Was Plagueis, with his cold experiments, more dangerous than Sidious with his galactic war, or did the apprentice who understood people prove far more deadly than the master who understood cells and spirits? When power and wisdom drift apart, which one truly threatens the light side most? Those questions can wait for another time. For now it is enough that the names begin to blur, that dates and titles grow soft around the edges, that Hego Damask and Darth Plagueis and Sidious and the long chain of Sith Lords become a single fading echo in the background. The Force still flows, the galaxy still turns, and it is safe to let this story dim, to let the last whisper of a moon on Megiddo and a master in the dark recede into silence until only breathing remains and sleep